Hi there, come on in and get settled wherever you are tonight. Pull the blanket up a little higher, sink into the pillow and let the day slide off your shoulders for a while. Tonight we are not visiting a castle or a battlefield or a royal court. Tonight we're going somewhere far older than any of that, somewhere so quiet and so dry that almost nothing about it has changed in 70 million years. So get comfortable, because this one starts with a mystery that left some of the smartest people in the world completely stumped. In the summer of 1948, a small group of scientists knelt in the dust of one of the loneliest places on Earth, brushing sand away from something that made every one of them go silent. It was not a skull. It was not a full skeleton. It was 3 claws, each one nearly as long as a baseball bat, curved like a scythe, and completely unlike anything any of them had studied before. And for the next several years, some of the most respected minds in the field would look at those claws and land on a conclusion so wrong and so wonderfully strange that people are still telling the story of that mistake to this day. Before we step into that desert together, if quiet, strange, true stories like this one are your kind of thing, a like or a subscribe helps more than you would think. It just lets me know to keep bringing these to you. And I am always a little curious, where are you tucking in from tonight, and what time is it wherever you are, because I love imagining all the different corners of the world this reaches while you drift off. Leave it in the comments, I read every single one, and if this story ends up becoming a favourite, I would love to hear that too. Now go ahead and turn the lights down as low as you can stand them. Maybe let a fan hum somewhere nearby for that soft, steady sound. And let's go find out what that desert had been hiding for 70 million years. Picture the Gobi Desert in the middle of summer and let go of whatever image just popped into your head, because it is probably wrong. This is not rolling golden dunes. It is a flat, cracked, sunburned plain of rock and pale clay stretching farther than your eyes can make sense of, with almost nothing standing taller than your knee. There is no shade out there. Not a scrap of it. The wind does not cool you down either. It just drags the heat from one place to another and hands it right back to you. Water has to be hauled in. Every meal has to be planned for. And in the summer of 1948, a joint expedition of Soviet, Mongolian and Chinese scientists pushed their trucks, quite literally at times, into the heart of that emptiness, toward a stretch of eroded cliffs and hollowed-out canyons known as the Nemegt Basin. Understand something about that expedition before we go any further. Mongolia had only recently opened its borders to outside researchers, and getting a team along with trucks, tools and enough supplies for weeks spent in the middle of nowhere, organised and approved, was its own kind of small miracle. Everyone on that expedition carried a certain weight of expectation with them, the hope of institutions back home, the pride of 2 nations choosing to work side by side in a place almost nobody had ever properly studied before. Nothing about this trip was low stakes, even before anyone had found a single bone. The man leading them was a Soviet paleontologist named Ivan Yefremov, and here is a detail about him that I have always found a little bit funny. By day he was serious, exacting, the kind of scientist who could spend an entire afternoon on his knees studying a single layer of rock for clues about creatures that had been dead for tens of millions of years. But at night in his tent after the work was done he wrote, not field notes, fiction. Yefremov was also a science fiction author, someone who spent his evenings dreaming up impossible futures and stranger worlds than the one he was standing in. So there is something almost poetic about what was about to happen to him, because the strangest, most unbelievable thing he would ever lay eyes on in his entire career was not something he was going to invent at his writing desk. It was already lying in the ground beneath his boots, waiting patiently the way things wait when they have had 70 million years of practice. He once described the way those cliffs behaved in the final minutes before sunset, how the red sandstone would seem to catch fire, glowing so bright that the whole basin looked like it was burning from the inside. There is something almost unfair about a place that beautiful also being one that could kill you slowly through heat and thirst if you were careless. That contradiction, gorgeous and unforgiving in the same breath, is the whole personality of the Gobi. And here is something worth sitting with for a moment before we go any further. This barren, sunburned basin was not always like this. 70 million years earlier, during the age we now call the Late Cretaceous, this same ground was a wide green floodplain laced with rivers and lakes, thick with plant life alive with the sound of creatures that would seem impossible to us now. Everything that team was walking over in 1948, every dry, cracked inch of it had once been soft, wet, and full of life. The desert had simply outlived it the way deserts eventually outlive everything. That is exactly where this story begins. The days out there followed a rhythm that had nothing gentle about it. Wake before the worst of the heat arrives. Walk the cliffs and gullies for hours scanning the ground for anything that looks less like rock and more like bone, which after enough time under that sun starts to feel like an impossible task, because everything out there eventually begins to look the same shade of pale, sunburned grey. Kneel. Brush. Move a few feet. Kneel again. Most days ended in sunburn aching knees, and maybe if you were fortunate, one small fragment of something interesting wrapped carefully in cloth and tucked into a bag. It was slow, patient, unglamorous work, the kind that demands a strange sort of faith, the quiet belief that somewhere underneath all that identical-looking rock something worth finding is actually waiting for you, and has been waiting for a very long time. There is a particular kind of tiredness that only comes from a day like that, the sun pressing down on the back of your neck, grit in your teeth, no matter how carefully you eat your canteen, always somehow already half empty. And yet night after night the team kept going back out at dawn because that is the strange pull of this kind of work. The desert gives you almost nothing for free, but the one thing it offers in exchange for all that discomfort is the small electric possibility that today might be the day. And then, in a stretch of exposed rock the geologists would later name the Nemegt Formation, someone's brush hit something that was not rock at all. It had a different weight to it under the bristles, a different sound, the kind of small detail that any experienced fossil hunter learns to trust instantly, the way you can tell the difference between a floorboard and a rug just from the way your foot lands on it. What came up out of that ground first was one long curved claw. Someone called the others over and the digging slowed to something almost reverent. Then close by a second claw, then a third, 3 of them each nearly 3 feet long as bare bone alone, and here is the detail that made more than one person's stomach turn a little, because in life those claws would not have looked like bone at all. They would have been wrapped in a hardened sheath built from the same material as your own fingernails, only thickened and toughened into something closer to horn, the way a bull's horn grows over the bone underneath it. That sheath would have added even more length on top of what they were holding in their hands. Nearly 3 feet of curved edge bone dressed in life in something even longer and sharper still. Now take a moment and actually picture that in your own hands. Something roughly the length of a hardcover book stood on end, curved like a hook, tapering to a point sharp enough to open skin without any effort at all. 3 of them side by side in the dirt, catching the last orange light of the afternoon. Every instinct in the human body reads that shape and whispers one word: predator. That is exactly what the team in the Nemegt Basin assumed too, and honestly it is hard to blame them. Nothing about those claws suggested gentleness. Nothing about them looked like they belonged to an animal that spent its days quietly reaching up into treetops for a snack. They looked like something built for violence, the kind of tool that should belong to a monster. 3 stories tall with a mouthful of teeth to match. But here is where the story takes its first strange turn, because the team kept digging around that spot carefully, hopefully for any sign of what those claws were attached to, and they found nothing. No skull, no jaw lined with teeth, no obvious skeleton to explain who or what those claws belonged to. Just the claws themselves sitting in that rock like a riddle someone had buried there on purpose, and then walked away, laughing. Try to imagine spending your entire career learning to read the story that bones tell you and then being handed only the very last 3 words of a sentence, with the rest of the page torn away and lost to time. That night, gathered around whatever passed for a fire out there in a landscape with almost nothing left to burn, the guesses started flying half serious and half not. Someone suggested it had to be some kind of enormous unknown predator, bigger than anything ever recorded. Someone else, only half joking, wondered aloud if they had just proven that monsters were real after all, and if so, whether it was too late to ask for a transfer somewhere a little safer. A third voice, quieter, pointed out that whatever this thing was, it had lived and died in this exact basin, walked over this exact ground, maybe not so very far from where they were sitting right now. Nobody slept particularly well after that comment. Even Yefremov, a man who invented impossible creatures for a living in his spare time, could not land anywhere close to what those claws actually belonged to. His imagination, as it turned out, was not nearly strange enough, because the true answer, when scientists finally settled on one several years later, is honestly one of my favourite wrong guesses in the entire history of paleontology, and it involves of all things an enormous ancient turtle. The team wrapped those 3 claws in cloth and padding as gently as you might wrap something alive, because in a sense that is exactly what they were carrying. The last physical trace of a creature that had not drawn breath in 70 million years. The journey back out of the Gobi took days on its own, jolting over rutted tracks in trucks never designed for this kind of terrain, every pothole a small reminder of how easily something that ancient and that fragile could be lost all over again after surviving this long buried in rock. From there the claws travelled thousands of miles further, still crated and shipped toward laboratories far from any desert, carried like a question nobody yet had the answer to. And for years afterward, in quiet offices with none of that Gobi heat, some very serious, very well-credentialed scientists sat with those same 3 curved bones on the table in front of them, turning them over and over under the light, sketching them, measuring them, arguing about them late into the evening. What they eventually decided, and just how spectacularly, wonderfully wrong an entire field of brilliant, well-trained people can be when they have only 3 claws, a lot of confidence in their own imagination to fill in the blanks, that is exactly where we are headed next. It is a mistake so specific, so oddly delightful, that it earned this creature a name it would carry for years before anyone realized how far off the mark it truly was. So stay right where you are, get a little more comfortable if you can, and keep those lights low, because we've only just started digging. 6 years. That is how long those 3 claws sat, cleaned, catalogued, and completely unexamined in a storage room thousands of miles from the desert that had given them up. The Gobi had already handed science its riddle back in 1948. Nobody sat down and actually tried solving it until 1954. It sounds almost unbelievable, doesn't it, that something this strange could just wait in a drawer for 6 full years? But that is how research often works behind the scenes. Institutes get busy. A country recovering from war has 100 more urgent priorities than 3 mysterious claws from Mongolia. Other fossils demand attention, funding runs thin, careers pull people in different directions. And so an answer to one of the strangest questions in paleontology waited patiently on a shelf, the way it had already waited for 70 million years, one more delay barely registering at all. The man who finally opened that drawer was a Russian scientist named Evgeny Maliev, And if you are picturing a lifelong dinosaur obsessive who had dreamed of this exact moment since childhood, I need to gently correct that image for you. Maliv had served on the front lines during the Second World War before he ever picked up a brush to clean a fossil, which is worth pausing on for a second. Imagine the kind of career shift that takes you from a battlefield to kneeling over 70-million-year-old bones with total focus. He studied biology at Moscow State University once the fighting was behind him, and his early academic work was not even about dinosaurs at all. His doctoral research focused on the skulls and necks of mammals, warm-blooded, fur-covered creatures about as different from a giant reptile as you can get. Picture that for a second, a man trained to study soft tissue and mammalian anatomy, about to become forever associated with one of the strangest reptiles ever pulled out of the ground. Life has a strange sense of humour sometimes about where it decides to send people. There is something worth picturing here beyond just the paperwork. Somewhere in that Moscow institute, Maliv actually had to pick that claw up, feel the real weight of it in his palm, run a thumb along the curve, notice the way 70 million years of mineral had replaced what was once living bone yet somehow kept every groove and ridge intact. Scientists rarely get to skip that step no matter how many photographs or reports come first. At some point the work becomes physical, a person alone in a quiet room with something ancient in their hands, trying to coax a story out of an object that cannot speak for itself. That is the moment this whole mistaken theory was actually born in, not in a lecture hall, but in the quiet weight of a fossil against skin. When Maliv finally sat down with what the 1948 expedition had brought back here, is exactly what was waiting for him on the table. 3 enormous claws, a single fragment of a hand bone, a handful of broken rib pieces. That was the entire case file, the whole of the evidence he had to work with. No skull, no spine, no legs, no teeth. If you have ever tried to guess an entire movie's plot from 3 random frames, somebody showed you completely out of context, you already understand the position Maliv found himself in, except in his case the stakes were a permanent scientific name, one that would follow this creature through every textbook and museum placard for decades to come. Here is where I want you to lean in a little, because this is the part of the story I find the most human. Maliv picked up those broken rib fragments and noticed something. They were unusually flat, almost paddle-shaped, nothing like the rounded curved ribs you would expect wrapped around the chest of a typical land-dwelling animal. To a scientist trained in comparative anatomy, that flatness said one very specific thing: an animal built to move through water, not across open ground. Ribs like that, in his experience, belong to swimmers. Add in claws the size of a small child standing upright, and his mind reached for the closest, most reasonable comparison available to him, at the time an enormous ancient sea turtle, the kind whose limbs had evolved over millions of years into broad, powerful flippers built to cut through open ocean. And honestly, that comparison was not some random leap into fantasy. Just a few decades earlier, on the other side of the planet in the American state of South Dakota, scientists had already pulled the skeleton of a truly enormous prehistoric sea turtle out of the ground, a creature called Archelon stretching somewhere close to 15 feet from head to tail and weighing more than a small car, the largest turtle ever confirmed to have existed on this planet. So when Maliv looked down at his flattened ribs and his gigantic claws, and pictured something roughly that same size gliding through a shallow Cretaceous sea, and using those massive claws to shear off mouthfuls of underwater vegetation from the sea floor, he was not inventing something out of thin air. He was reaching for the one real documented example science already had on record of exactly this kind of oceanic giant. Would you have guessed any differently with only 3 claws, some flat ribs, and one famous giant turtle already sitting in the record books as your only point of comparison. So he wrote it up and he gave it a name, and this happens to be one of my favourite dinosaur names in existence, once you understand where it actually comes from. He kept a word that pointed straight at those claws, calling the genus Therizinosaurus, which essentially translates to scythe lizard, because nothing about those enormous curved blades looked like anything except a farming tool built for reaping through wheat. But then for the species name he added Cheloniformis, meaning shaped like a turtle. Put the two halves together and you get a creature whose entire scientific name translates roughly to turtle-shaped scythe lizard, a name that manages to be almost completely wrong and strangely poetic at exactly the same time. He published the idea in a Russian science journal under a title that translated plainly simply announced a new turtle-like reptile from Mongolia, describing to the world an animal that did not so much walk the earth as paddle through it. That journal, worth knowing, was not some obscure academic newsletter buried in a university basement. It was a publication meant for a wide, curious general readership, closer to a popular science magazine than a specialist paper only a handful of experts would ever open. Which means this was not a quiet, cautious footnote added to the scientific record. It was in its own way a small public announcement, a strange new sea creature introduced to an audience of ordinary readers who had no reason at all to doubt a respected researcher's careful conclusion. Can we sit with that for a second, because I think there is something in this worth carrying with you well beyond the desert and the dinosaurs. Have you ever built an entire theory in your head, out of only a few pieces of evidence, felt completely confident in it, defended it even, and only much later discovered the real picture looked almost nothing like what you'd imagined? Maybe it was a person you misjudged after one strange conversation, a situation at work you were sure you understood after hearing just one side of it, or a diagnosis you gave yourself at 2 a.m. after reading 3 unrelated symptoms online. Most of us have done exactly that, at some point, usually in far smaller, far more forgivable ways than naming an entire new species for the whole scientific world to read about, but the shape of the mistake is identical. We're all almost constantly filling in blanks with our best available guess using whatever fragments we happen to be holding at the time, and every so often the best guess anyone in the room has still turns out to be beautifully completely wrong. There is no shame in that. The only real mistake would be refusing to update the theory once better evidence finally walks through the door. I want to be fair to Maliv here because it would be easy sitting comfortably decades later with the benefit of hindsight to make him sound careless, and he really was not. This was a serious, deeply respected scientist working with painfully thin evidence and doing exactly what a good scientist is supposed to do, building the most reasonable explanation the available facts could support at the time. This is the very same researcher who around that same period named the fearsome tyrannosaur Tarbosaurus and the armoured tank-like Talururus, both of which remain accepted foundational discoveries in paleontology to this day. He was also by most accounts refreshingly hands-on, with his methods in the most literal sense possible, at one point actually cutting open fossilised dinosaur skulls with a diamond saw, just to study the shape of the brain cavity hidden inside decades before anyone had the option of a gentle, non-destructive scan to do that same job from the comfort of a computer screen. It was crude by modern standards, no question about that, but it was also exactly the kind of stubborn hands, dirty curiosity that pushes an entire field forward, even on the occasions when it leads somewhere completely wrong. And for a remarkably long stretch of time, wrong simply was the accepted answer. For roughly the next 16 years, that image an enormous claw, wielding sea turtle gliding through a shallow Cretaceous ocean, sat quietly in the scientific record almost entirely unchallenged. The handful of illustrations attempted during that era leaned fully into that picture, something broad-bodied, flattened and aquatic, dragging those tremendous claws through thick underwater vegetation like garden shears. Museum placards where this creature was mentioned at all described a gentle sea-dwelling reptile rather than anything resembling a dinosaur. A child flipping through an encyclopedia in 1960 somewhere far from Mongolia would have read a confident matter-of-fact paragraph about a giant turtle from Asia and had absolutely no reason to question a single word of it, because why would they? The adults writing those books did not doubt it either. Nobody was rushing to question any of it because there was nothing new to measure it against, no second specimen, no fresh perspective, nothing but the same 3 claws sitting quietly in their drawer while an entire imagined creature grew up around them in textbooks that most readers had no reason to doubt. Then in 1970, a different Russian paleontologist named Anatoly Rojdestvensky went back through that same handful of fragments with fresh skeptical eyes, and he simply was not convinced. Something about the curve of those claws, about their proportions, about the way they would have had to attach to a hand and a wrist did not sit right with him for a marine reptile at all. Turtle flippers, he knew, simply do not grow claws, shaped quite like this hooked-bladed built for leverage rather than paddling. It is worth asking yourself, would you have caught that detail 16 years into an accepted theory, with every textbook and every colleague around you already comfortable with the turtle explanation? Doubting a settled answer takes a particular kind of nerve, especially when doubting it means questioning a respected colleague's published work. When Rojdestvensky finally put his objection into print, it pulled the rug out from under 16 years of comfortably accepted science in a single sentence. This was never a turtle, he argued. It was some kind of dinosaur, and not just any dinosaur, but a member of the same violent predatory family that included the very largest meat-eating hunters this planet has ever produced, for anyone who's not deep into dinosaur classification. And honestly, why would you be that particular family Rojdestvensky pointed toward is the same broad group that eventually gave the world creatures like Tyrannosaurus itself, animals built around speed, power, and a mouthful of blade-like teeth. So imagine the whiplash inside that small circle of specialists who actually followed this case closely. First, this mystery creature had been treated as a slow, gentle plant grazing sea turtle for 16 straight years. Now, in a single afternoon of careful re-examination, it had been reassigned to the same rough neighborhood of the family tree as history's most famous killer. For the scientists who had built careers around the earlier explanation, this was not a small correction to shrug off. It was a complete reversal. The gentle giant of the ocean suddenly rebranded as some kind of land-based nightmare. Neither label, as it eventually turned out, would come anywhere close to the truth. But nobody standing in that room in 1970 had any way of knowing that yet. Now sit with that for just a moment, because if Malev's original guess struck you as strange, this new one somehow made the whole picture even more confusing rather than less. If Rojdestvensky was right, and this really was some kind of predator, then where was the rest of the animal? Where was the skull built for tearing through flesh? Where were the legs built for the kind of speed a hunter would actually need to survive? Scientists had essentially traded one incomplete picture for another, one mystery for a stranger one. And the shelves of that same Moscow Institute now held 2 separate unrelated headaches, a mislabeled turtle with dinosaur claws on one side of the building, and as it happens, something equally impossible sitting almost within walking distance the entire time, because the real answer was never going to come from staring harder at these same 3 claws alone. It would come from something else entirely, something already sitting at that very moment in a museum collection, far from the Gobi mislabeled and just as misunderstood in its own way a pair of arms so enormous, so completely disproportionate to anything reasonable, that the very first people to lay eyes on them assumed without a shred of doubt that they belonged to the single most terrifying predator the Cretaceous world had ever produced. Whatever that thing turned out to be, one look told everyone in the room it was going to make 3 curved claws seem almost tame by comparison. July the 9th, 1965. Write that date down somewhere in the back of your mind, because we are about to spend some real time there. On that particular day, in a stretch of the Gobi known as Altanula, a small, unremarkable-looking hill of sandstone was about to hand over something that would confuse an entire branch of science for close to 5 decades. The person kneeling in that sand was not Russian this time. She was Polish, and her name was Zofia Kielan-Jaworowska, and before we even get to what she found, I want to tell you how she ended up there in the first place. Because honestly, her path to that hillside is just as remarkable as anything buried underneath it. Zofia grew up in Poland during the German occupation in the Second World War, at a time when simply attending a university lecture could put your life at risk. Warsaw's own Department of Geology had been destroyed outright, the building gone, its instruments and collections scattered or lost. So a Polish paleontologist named Roman Kozlowski did something quietly defiant about that. He kept teaching anyway out of his own apartment in secret to a small handful of students who understood exactly what could happen to them if they were ever caught. Zofia was one of those students sitting in a cramped living room instead of a proper lecture hall, absorbing science that an occupying army had tried very hard to make disappear entirely from Polish life. It was there in that apartment, listening to a man teach paleontology under the constant threat of arrest, that she first let herself dream about Mongolia, a place about as far removed from wartime Warsaw as anywhere on the map. Here is a question worth sitting with for a second. How many dreams have you personally set aside because the timing felt wrong, because the obstacles looked too large, because everyone around you would have quietly told you it was not realistic? Zofia had every reason in the world to let that particular dream go, and honestly nobody would have blamed her for doing exactly that. She simply did not. 2 decades later, the political map of the world had shifted just enough to make that old, half-forgotten dream possible again. Mongolia closed for years to researchers from Western nations, remained open to scientists from Poland, and the rest of what was then called the Eastern Bloc, a strange narrow window created almost entirely by Cold War politics rather than scientific merit. It is a strange thing to think about, that a young woman's chance to finally reach the desert she had dreamed about since a secret wartime lecture depended less on her own talent, which was considerable, and more on which side of a very tense global divide her passport happened to belong to. Zofia walked straight through that window the moment it opened. By the mid-1960s, she was not simply joining these expeditions into the Gobi Desert. She was organising and personally leading them, coordinating food-water transportation, and permits for a team of roughly 30 people in one of the least forgiving environments on the planet, the majority of whom did not speak her language in a country whose language she herself did not speak either. Sandstorms could bury an entire campsite overnight without warning. Water had to be measured and rationed almost like currency. And she was doing all of this as one of the only women, if not the only woman, leading a dinosaur expedition anywhere in the world at that particular moment in history. Let that sit with you for a second before we move on to the discovery itself, because I do not think it is a footnote to this story. In more than one real sense, it is the story. On the morning of July the 9th, her team was working a site called Altanula, the Third, a low sun-bleached rise of sandstone that had already produced its share of interesting fragments over the previous few seasons of digging. The heat that time of year would have been relentless by mid-morning, the kind that makes tools too hot to hold bare-handed and turns every hour of careful, deliberate brushwork into something closer to endurance than science. And there, emerging slowly from the rock under careful brushes layer by layer, was something that made even a team of experienced, well-travelled fossil hunters stop completely and stare in open confusion. Not a skull, not a spine, a pair of arms. Enormous ones, nearly 8 feet long, each still attached to their own shoulder bones, and a scattering of ribs tipped with curved claws, roughly the length of a bowling pin standing on end. The crew spent close to 3 full days on that single spot, easing the surrounding rock away millimetre by millimetre, aware, even as they worked, that they were looking at something no textbook on their shelves back home had ever prepared them for. Take a moment and actually picture the scale of that, because raw numbers rarely land the way a direct comparison does. Stretch your own arm out in front of you right now if you want to, and now imagine a single bone inside that arm being longer than most adults standing upright. These were not proportionally large arms attached to some modest-sized body hiding just beneath the surface. These were arms that entirely on their own, without anything else attached to them at all, stood roughly as tall as a grown man leaning against a wall. Whatever this animal turned out to be its owner, had just handed paleontology one single, isolated body part, and absolutely nothing else to go on, and somehow that one part alone was enough to stop an experienced excavation team cold in their tracks. And here the team did the only thing any of us would probably do in that exact position. They started doing quiet math in their heads, comparing what they had just pulled out of the ground to the one truly massive predator that science already had solid, well-documented measurements for Tyrannosaurus. A full-grown Tyrannosaurus, something in the neighbourhood of 40 feet long from nose to tail, walked around with arms barely a yard in length, almost comically undersized for the sheer bulk of the animal they were attached to. So if this brand new creature's arms alone stretched close to 8 feet, and if you simply scaled that same rough ratio upward across an entire body, the number you eventually landed on was almost too large to say out loud with a straight face. Something pushing 30 meters, close to 100 feet, a carnivore if that is truly what this thing turned out to be. That would have made even the largest known Tyrannosaurus look almost modest and unremarkable by comparison. Now I want to pause here and be completely honest with you, because a good storyteller should never let a dramatic number slide past without a little healthy scrutiny. That kind of simple scaling, take one single measurement and apply the exact same ratio across the whole animal, rarely holds up the way it does neatly on paper. Big animals are not just small animals stretched out evenly in every direction. Like a photograph being enlarged, their proportions bend and shift in ways that straightforward arithmetic tends to completely miss. The people standing in that trench back in 1965 almost certainly understood that limitation too, at least the more careful and cautious among them. But understanding that the math has limits does not stop your imagination from racing anyway, especially when you are personally holding a fossilized claw taller than your own knee, out in the middle of a silent, darkening desert with the sun dropping fast and absolutely no skull, no legs, no ribs beyond a few scattered fragments to actually tell you what you were looking at. Here is a question for you, and I mean this one honestly, not just as a storytelling device to fill space. Has a single overwhelming detail ever completely hijacked your judgment about something or someone before you had the full picture in front of you? One striking fact, one dramatic first impression, and suddenly your entire imagination reorganizes itself around that single data point, quietly filling in every missing gap to match whatever conclusion feels most dramatic. That is precisely what happened to an entire generation of paleontologists standing around those two enormous arms. The claws were real. The size was real. Almost everything they assumed about the creature actually attached to them was not. The bones were carefully excavated over the following days, wrapped in protective plaster, catalogued by hand, and eventually shipped back across the world to Warsaw, where they sat for a few years awaiting a formal, proper scientific description, the same slow, unhurried institutional rhythm we already watched play out once earlier in this very story, with a completely different set of claws from a completely different desert expedition. It was not until 1970 that two other researchers, Halska Osmolska and Iwa Roniewicz, finally sat down and gave this creature its official scientific name, one that did not try particularly hard to hide how unsettling those arms had seemed to absolutely everyone who'd ever touched them. They called it Deinocheirus. Break that word apart and it comes almost directly from ancient Greek deinos, meaning terrible or fearsome, the very same root that eventually gives us the word dinosaur itself, and care meaning hand, terrible hand. Then for the species portion of the name they added mirificus, a Latin word that lands somewhere between wonderful and strange, extraordinary, in the sense of being almost impossible to fully believe. Put the whole name together and you get something close to the wonderfully terrible hand, which might honestly be one of the most fitting dinosaur names ever assigned to anything in the entire history of the science, because that is exactly what those two researchers had sitting in front of them, a piece of anatomy simultaneously astonishing and deeply unsettling, with absolutely no explanation attached to any of it. I want you to notice something here because it connects directly back to a pattern we already spent real time on earlier in this very story. Once again, science had been handed an isolated, spectacular piece of anatomy with almost nothing surrounding it to provide any real context, and once again the natural human instinct, expert or otherwise, leaned immediately toward the most frightening available explanation. Enormous claws meant a monster the first time around. Enormous arms meant a monster the second time around. There is something worth sitting with in that repeated pattern, something almost a little bit funny, if it were not also so deeply understandable. Hand a group of very smart, very well-trained people one dramatic clue and almost no supporting evidence to go along with it, and the story they eventually build around that clue will more often than not drift toward the most dramatic possible version of events available. That is not some unique flaw belonging only to paleontologists. That is simply how human imagination tends to behave when it is starved for real information and handed something enormous to stare at instead. Word of the discovery spread through the wider scientific community, and museums and illustrators of that era, working with essentially the same limited scraps of information as everyone else, leaned into the most sensational interpretation available. Because honestly, what else were they realistically supposed to do with two giant arms and nothing else to draw from? Sketches began circulating of some hulking, upright, killer arms spread impossibly wide, claws fully extended, standing in for a body that nobody had actually found yet. It became almost overnight one of the most talked about mysteries in the entire field of paleontology, a genuine monster hiding somewhere in plain sight, known to the world only by its two terrible hands. And here is the detail I find almost impossible to walk past without pointing out. The very same woman who unearthed those arms would go on across those same remarkable expeditions to uncover several of the most famous dinosaur fossils ever pulled from the ground, including a pair of skeletons locked together in the middle of an actual life or death struggle. A small predator and a horned plant-eater frozen in combat at the exact moment. Both animals died a discovery so vivid and so complete that it is now considered one of Mongolia's true national treasures, protected and displayed with the kind of reverence usually reserved for royal artifacts. She was not a one-time lucky visitor to that desert, stumbling into a single headline making find before fading from the story. She kept going back year after year, expedition after expedition, and kept finding things that reshaped an entire field, this terrifying pair of arms simply being one entry on a much longer list. There is a particular kind of quiet courage in that showing up to the same brutal, unforgiving landscape summer after summer, not because the first success guaranteed the next one, but because the work itself, patient and repetitive, and often disappointing, was worth doing regardless of whether the desert decided to reward you that season or not. But here is what none of them could have possibly known standing in that Warsaw laboratory in 1970, turning those bones over slowly under the light. The real animal attached to those arms was going to spend the next several decades refusing to show itself, buried somewhere out in that same unforgiving desert, patiently waiting for the rest of its own story to finally be uncovered. Entire careers would come and go. Expeditions would return to that same general region again and again, hoping for a skull, a leg, anything at all, and leave with nothing more than the same two haunting arms already sitting in a drawer back home. For close to 50 years, that silence would only grow louder, turning this creature into something closer to legend than science. A name paleontologists whispered to each other, the way you might mention an unsolved case that everyone had quietly stopped expecting to close. And when that long wait eventually did end, what scientists finally uncovered was going to be so far removed from every monstrous sketch and every worried whisper in the scientific community that it would completely rewrite how an entire generation of researchers thought about jumping to conclusions from a single spectacular clue. For the next several decades, this creature would essentially audition for half a dozen different identities and get almost every single one of them wrong, sometimes spectacularly. So sometimes in ways that only look obvious, now looking backward with all the answers already sitting comfortably in our lap. The very first attempt at labelling it, back when Osmolska and Ronowicz first described those arms in 1970, placed it inside a group called carnosaurs. If that word means nothing to you, do not worry, it barely meant anything precise to paleontologists either at the time. Carnosaur back then functioned less like a specific well-defined family and more like a scientific junk drawer, a catch-all category, where researchers tossed any sufficiently large, sufficiently mysterious, meat-eating dinosaur that did not obviously belong anywhere else yet. Saying something was a carnosaur in 1970 was a little like saying a stray object found in your garage was probably tool-shaped. Technically descriptive. Not exactly illuminating. It told you almost nothing about how the animal actually lived, only that it was big and that nobody had a better box to put it in yet. Every field of science has a drawer like that, somewhere a polite way of admitting the honest truth, which is simply, we are not sure yet, please hold. Almost immediately, though, cracks started showing in that first guess. Within just a couple of years, other researchers examining the same bones began noticing something odd. Certain proportions and joint structures in that arm bore an uncomfortable resemblance not to the heavyset muscular predators everyone had originally pictured, but to a completely different, much lither group of dinosaurs nicknamed the ostrich mimics, animals built for speed rather than raw destructive power, with long necks, small toothless heads, and legs clearly designed for covering ground quickly rather than wrestling prey to the earth. Picture the tonal whiplash in that for a moment. One decade you are cast as the horrifying rival to Tyrannosaurus, a creature dreamed up specifically to terrify. The next, someone gently, almost apologetically suggests you might actually be a distant, oddly oversized cousin of a dinosaur, built more like a giant flightless bird than a monster. Neither label had anywhere near enough evidence behind it to be considered settled, but both would circulate side by side, competing for attention in textbooks and documentaries for years to come. Here is where the story gets properly tangled and where I think it becomes worth slowing down for a moment, because this is not a detail most retellings of this particular case bother mentioning. For years afterward, a meaningful faction within the scientific community argued this creature actually belonged somewhere else entirely, grouped alongside the very same strange claw-handed family we already spent real time with earlier tonight, the Therizinosaurs. Think about that for a second, because it is honestly one of my favourite quiet coincidences in this entire story. Two of the most bizarre theropod mysteries of the entire 20th century, discovered decades apart on completely separate expeditions by scientists from separate countries who likely never once discussed the connection over coffee, kept circling back toward each other in the scientific literature again and again, purely because their single most striking feature, those absurd oversized claws, kept tempting researchers into drawing a line between them. For a real stretch of years, some of the smartest people working on Mongolian dinosaurs sincerely believed these two creatures might be close relatives, cousins from the very same strange claw-wielding branch of the family tree published side by side in comparison papers that treated the connection as a reasonable, defensible hypothesis rather than idle speculation. It would take decades of additional evidence to finally rule that connection out for good, but the fact that it was ever seriously considered at all tells you something important about just how little solid information either mystery had attached to it at the time. Two riddles born an ocean apart in terms of scientific attention kept mistaking each other for the answer. Can I ask you something here? And I want you to actually sit with it for a moment rather than just letting it slide past. Have you ever lived with a question that simply refused to close something you turned over in your id for years without ever landing on a fully satisfying answer? Most of us eventually stop actively hunting for a resolution and just quietly learn to hold the uncertainty instead, folding it into the background of daily life, the way you might live around a locked drawer, whose key you lost so long ago you've half forgotten what was even inside it. That is essentially what an entire branch of science did with this particular animal for close to 4 decades. Not ignoring it exactly, more like learning to coexist peacefully with not knowing, checking in on the question every few years without ever quite expecting it to resolve. There is a kind of quiet maturity in that, honestly. The ability to hold a question open indefinitely without needing to force a premature answer onto it just for the comfort of having one. Science at its healthiest is remarkably good at that particular skill, better than most of us manage in our own personal lives if we are being completely honest with each other tonight. And in that long stretch of not knowing something almost inevitable happened, human imagination did precisely what human imagination always does. When it's handed a vacuum, it started filling the empty space with pictures of its own invention. Illustrators, museum designers, and toy manufacturers all took their own turn guessing at what the rest of this animal might have looked like, and because they were all working from essentially the same tiny scrap of information, their results swung wildly depending on which decade you happen to be looking at. Some renderings from the 1970s and 80s leaned fully into the horror angle, a hulking bipedal killer with those enormous arms, spread wide teeth, bared built to terrify a child, flipping through a dinosaur encyclopedia right before bed, which, if you think about it, is a slightly uncomfortable image for a channel like this one to be lingering on right before sleep. So let's move past that particular version fairly quickly. Other artists working from the Therizinosaur theory pictured something stranger still, a pot-bellied, slow-moving giant with a small head and a long neck, using those tremendous claws for something closer to gathering than hunting. By the early 2000s, once the ostrich mimic idea had mostly won out among specialists, you start seeing a third version altogether, essentially an enormous, almost comically oversized relative of Gallimimus, one of the properly fast, remarkably lightly built ostrich dinosaurs that had coincidentally been pulled out of that same Gobi Desert by that same relentless Polish-led expedition we spent real time with earlier tonight. As late as 2012, with the real answer only 2 years away, and nobody involved having the faintest idea how close they actually were, at least one commercial model of this animal was released covered in feathers. A guess that happened to be closer to the eventual truth than almost anyone realized at the time, though, for entirely different reasons than the sculptor probably intended. 3, arguably 4 completely different animals, 3 or 4 completely different personalities, almost all wearing the exact same pair of arms as their only confirmed, universally agreed upon feature. There is something almost funny about that if you let yourself see it that way, and also something a little bit humbling underneath the humour. An entire creature's public identity debated in academic journals, and painted onto museum walls and printed into encyclopedias that actual children were reading and trusting completely, hinged on essentially nothing more than 2 bones and a tall stack of educated guesses layered one on top of another across 40 straight years. It is worth remembering the next time you see a confident-looking illustration of any extinct animal hanging in a museum that confidence and accuracy are not always the same thing, and sometimes a particular image gets repeated so often in so many books that it starts to feel true purely through sheer repetition, regardless of how solid the actual evidence underneath it happens to be. By the later years of that long silence, this particular case had earned itself something close to legendary status inside paleontology circles, less a routine unsolved question, and more the kind of story researchers would bring up at conferences with a knowing, slightly wistful smile, the great headless riddle of the Gobi. Students training to become paleontologists themselves were sometimes introduced to this exact case as a teaching example, offered up as proof that even in a field built entirely on careful physical evidence, there will always be limits to what a handful of bones can honestly tell you, no matter how badly the people studying them want those bones to tell them more. Every few years, a science magazine somewhere would run a short piece revisiting the mystery, dusting off the same 2 photographs of those enormous arms, asking the same unanswered question all over again to a slightly new generation of curious readers who had never heard the story before. In a strange way, the not knowing had become part of the appeal. A dinosaur famous less for what it was than for how thoroughly, how persistently it refused to say. Then in 2006 and again in 2009, that long silence finally truly started to break. A joint Korean and Mongolian research team, this one led by a paleontologist named Yongnam Lee, returned to the Nemegt Formation, the very same stretch of desert that had already produced both of the mysteries we have spent this whole story following, and this time they were not walking away with mere fragments. Across those 2 separate seasons, the team uncovered 2 distinct partial skeletons, and together, when carefully laid out side by side back at the lab, those 2 specimens finally supplied something nobody had possessed in over 40 years, an actual body. Ribs, a pelvis, long powerful legs, a tail with an unusual row of tall spines running along its back, the kind of feature that made absolutely no sense next to any of the 3 or 4 guesses that had circulated for decades. Suddenly, after 4 decades of pure speculation stacked on top of more speculation, science had something close to an actual animal to study instead of 2 lonely arms sitting quietly in a drawer. But here is the detail that makes this particular breakthrough almost unbearably cruel if you sit with it for a moment, because the universe apparently has a genuine sense of humour about these things. Of everything that finally came out of that ground, the 2 single most important pieces, The two pieces that could have ended this entire argument in a single afternoon were missing completely. No skull, no feet. The exact parts of any animal that tell you the most about how it actually lived, what it ate, how it moved through its world were simply not there. Almost as though the desert itself had decided this particular mystery deserved just a little more patience before finally giving up its last secret. Imagine spending 40 years waiting for a single letter, finally having it arrive, and discovering the envelope had been opened already, with the two most important pages quietly removed before it ever reached you. And when the research team finally reached that second site in the middle of August 2009, they arrived at a quarry already scattered with broken fossil-bearing blocks and isolated bones lying strangely out of place, tool marks visible in the rock where no careful scientific hand had made them. And they noticed something that should have concerned them immediately. This ground had clearly already been disturbed before they ever set foot on it. Someone else had been here first, working quickly, working carelessly, leaving behind exactly the kind of mess that careful, methodical excavation simply does not produce the fossil equivalent of finding your own front door already unlocked and slightly ajar. At the time, the team had no real way of fully understanding what that meant or where the missing pieces of their nearly complete skeleton had actually ended up. They finished their careful work anyway, documenting everything, salvaging what remained, professional to the end even while standing in the aftermath of someone else's carelessness. Because as it turned out, that skull and those feet had not simply vanished into geological time the way missing fossils usually do. They'd already been found years earlier by someone else entirely, someone who was never going to hand them over quietly or willingly, and the story of how those exact pieces eventually made their way back to where they belonged is honestly one of the strangest chapters in this entire tale, one we will get to in its own proper time with all the tension and slow unravelling it fully deserves. For now though, let's leave that particular thread hanging exactly where the 2009 excavation team left it, standing in a half-emptied quarry holding most of an animal missing its face, missing the very feet that would eventually help confirm how it actually walked through its world. Because while that headless, footless skeleton sat freshly uncovered under the Mongolian sun, the answer to the other half of tonight's story, the one that actually started us off the scythe-clawed mystery from the very first claws we ever talked about, had already quietly begun taking shape years earlier in a completely different corner of that same unforgiving desert, thanks to a handful of much smaller, far less famous dinosaurs that almost nobody outside the field had ever even heard of, dinosaurs whose only real claim to fame until this exact moment in our story was simply being in the right place, buried at the right depth, at exactly the right time. 1973, a different corner of the Gobi this time, hundreds of miles from either of the sites we have already spent time at tonight, a stretch of badlands called Bayan Shireh. And the person kneeling in this particular patch of sand was not Russian, and was not Polish either. For the first time in our whole story so far, he was Mongolian, a young paleontologist named Altangerel Perle, working in the very desert his own country had spent decades watching foreign expeditions quietly carry pieces of away trip after trip, crate after crate headed for institutes and laboratories, thousands of miles from where the bones themselves had actually lived and died. I think that detail deserves a moment of its own before we move forward. For 25 years, the two mysteries we have been following tonight had been handled almost entirely by outside hands, Soviet scientists, Polish scientists, eventually Korean scientists. All of them welcomed, all of them truly essential to everything discovered so far, but all of them in the end visitors passing through, however skilled or well-intentioned. Pearl was not passing through. This was his home ground, his own country's deep past, and the answer that had deluded everyone else for a quarter of a century was about to come, at least in part from someone who had grown up looking at that same horizon, his entire life someone for whom this desert was not a research destination, requiring a long flight and careful planning, but simply home. What Pearl uncovered at a locality called Amtgei that year was not another lonely claw or a pair of disconnected arms. It was an actual partial skeleton, jaws, a string of vertebrae, part of a pelvis, sections of limb, more connected material sitting together in one place than either of our two ongoing mysteries had produced across their combined 50 years of digging. Picture the difference for a second. Everything we have talked about tonight up to this point has essentially been isolated puzzle pieces handed to scientists one at a time, a claw here, an arm there, nothing ever quite touching anything else. Pearl, for the first time in this entire story, was holding something closer to an actual sentence instead of scattered letters. And here is the detail I find almost unbearably charming about this whole chapter of the story. Pearl had absolutely no idea, at least not yet, that what he was holding had anything whatsoever to do with either of the creatures we've already spent hours getting to know tonight. As far as he could tell, he had simply found a new, unusually strange theropod full stop, its own separate little mystery with no relation to anyone else's. He spent years working through what he had, and in 1979 he finally gave it a name, Segnosaurus galbanensis. If you're wondering why that particular name never made it into the popular imagination, the way Tyrannosaurus or Velociraptor did here is a small piece of trivia worth knowing. Segnosaurus was actually the very first member of this entire strange family to receive a scientific name at all, technically earlier and more complete than either of the two more famous mysteries this whole story revolves around. It simply never got the chance to become a household name because nobody yet understood it was about to become the key that unlocked two much more famous puzzles at once. The jaws alone told Pearl something was deeply unusual here. They were slender, oddly proportioned, nothing like the heavy tooth-crowded jaws you would expect on a proper predator built for tearing flesh. But Pearl cautious the way any good scientist should be with an animal. This strange did not leap immediately to any grand conclusion about diet or lifestyle. He simply described what was in front of him as precisely as he could, and let the evidence sit there, waiting for more context that, as it turned out, was already on its way. Because the very next year, 1980, Pearl and a colleague named Rinchen Barsbold working together described a second creature from that same general region, one that had actually been sitting in the ground since 1972, first pulled out of a place called Beishinzav during an earlier joint expedition. They called it Erlikosaurus, and I want you to sit with the name itself for a second because I think it might be my favourite naming choice in this entire story. Erlik in traditional Mongolian mythology is the god who rules over the underworld, the Lord of the Dead. Pearl and Barsbold named this creature after him. A demon's lizard. Something that sounds on paper like it belongs in a nightmare. The second half of the species name interestingly honoured an American explorer named Roy Chapman Andrews, who had led some of the very first organised fossil expeditions into the Gobi back in the 1920s, decades before any of the scientists in tonight's story ever set foot there. In a strange way, that one name managed to reach backward across 60 years of Gobi exploration and forward into ancient Mongolian mythology at the exact same time, and here is the part that gets me every single time I think about it. What actually came attached to that terrifying name was a skull roughly the length of a dinner plate, with a toothless beak-like tip at the very front covered in life by the same tough material that coats a bird's beak today, and behind that beak a row of small blunt leaf-shaped teeth, utterly incapable of tearing through flesh, perfectly suited instead for stripping soft vegetation off a branch. The demon of the underworld, once scientists finally got a proper look at its face, turned out to have the eating habits of a particularly enthusiastic vegetarian. If you have been waiting all night for the moment this story finally starts to earn its title, I think this is honestly it. A creature named after the ruler of death itself, and it could not have hurt you if it tried. Can we pause on that for a second, because I think there is something worth carrying home from it, beyond just the desert and the dinosaurs. How often do we do exactly what those old mythmakers did centuries earlier, without even meaning to hand something a frightening name, a frightening reputation based purely on how it looks, or how it is described second-hand long before we ever actually sit down and look closely at what is really there? Ehrlich's lizard needed nothing more than an honest look at its own teeth to completely undo thousands of years of implied menace built into its own name. Here is why that particular skull mattered so enormously to our two bigger mysteries, the ones we actually came here for tonight. For the entire history of both Therizinosaurus and the creature we now call Deinocheirus science had been staring at isolated limbs with absolutely no face to study, no jaw to examine, nothing to definitively settle the question of diet or lifestyle one way or the other. Erlikosaurus related closely enough in body plan to matter, finally handed paleontologists something neither of our headline mysteries had ever been able to offer on their own, an actual mouth. And that mouth told an unambiguous story. Whatever this strange claw-handed family of dinosaurs actually was, it was not built for hunting. Now here comes the moment I have honestly been looking forward to telling you about since we started this whole story hours ago. In 1982, Pearl was examining a partial hind limb, 4 toes, still attached unearthed, at a place called Herminsev, and he noticed something that connected directly back to a discovery Barsbold had made 6 years earlier, in 1976, when a set of partial arm bones, not just claws this time, but actual forearm material had been recovered from the Nemegt Formation, and tentatively linked to Therizinosaurus, based on how closely the claws matched. That 4-toed leg, Pearl realized, bore an unmistakable resemblance to the legs already known from Segnosaurus and its relatives. Put those two observations together, arms that behaved like a Segnosaur's arms, a leg found nearby that looked exactly like a Segnosaur's leg, and Pearl reached the conclusion that would finally end 32 years of confusion. Therizinosaurus, the very creature whose 3 lonely claws had once been mistaken for an ocean-going turtle, was not a turtle, was not simply some unspecified predator either, as one scientist had proposed 12 years earlier. It belonged quite comfortably in the very same strange plant-eating family as a demon lizard with a toothless beak and an oddly named creature originally mistaken for a giant killer. I want you to notice something about how that answer actually arrived, because I think it is maybe the most important observation in this entire story so far. Nobody solved Therizinosaurus's identity by staring harder at its own 3 famous claws. Scientists had been doing exactly that on and off for 32 straight years, and it had gotten them a turtle theory, and then a predator theory, both wrong. The answer came sideways instead from a completely different specimen in a completely different part of the desert, studied by a completely different scientist, who was not even trying to solve that particular mystery when he found it. Have you ever noticed that about your own life? That some of the most stubborn, most personal questions about who you are or what you're meant to do rarely get solved by staring directly at yourself in a mirror, turning the same thoughts over and over on a loop. More often, clarity arrives sideways too, through a conversation you were not expecting to matter, a completely unrelated experience that happens to rhyme with your own situation, in some way you could not have planned for or gone looking for on purpose. Science, it turns out, works roughly the same way most of the time, The answer to a question rarely comes from staring harder at the question itself. It comes from context, from relationships, from the company. That question happens to be found standing near. I do want to be honest with you about one thing, because a tidy instant resolution makes for a better story than what actually happened, and I promised you accuracy over neat packaging tonight. Pearl's conclusion did not immediately convince everyone in the field. Just 2 years later, in 1984, another respected researcher named Gregory Paul published a competing argument suggesting this entire strange family was not made of theropods at all, but rather represented some transitional oddity between older plant-eating dinosaurs and the group that would eventually become horned and armoured dinosaurs. It is a perfectly reasonable position to have held at the time, given how many features of this family, the wide hips, the small head, the general body proportions really did superficially resemble those unrelated plant-eaters, rather than anything in the theropod family. For a while, both interpretations existed side by side in the scientific literature, argued over at conferences, debated politely, and not so politely in journals, exactly the kind of healthy, occasionally uncomfortable disagreement that good science actually depends on to sharpen itself over time. It would take further discoveries, additional skeletons, better preserved specimens found over the following decade, particularly out of China, to finally settle the argument firmly in favour of what Perler had proposed all along: theropods. After all, just theropods that had wandered about as far from their meat-eating relatives as evolution ever seems to allow a single family to wander, but settle it eventually did. And there was one more quiet, satisfying consequence buried inside all of this careful reclassification work, one that closes a loop we left dangling earlier tonight. The very same research that finally placed Therizinosaurus correctly within this bizarre gentle family also helped separate it once and for all from the other great mystery we've been following, the one known only by its enormous arms. For years, remember, those two riddles had been tangled together in the scientific literature, each one occasionally mistaken for evidence about the other cousins on paper, who turned out to share almost nothing beyond a passing resemblance in one single body part. This careful, unglamorous work on smaller, more complete relatives is what finally allowed scientists to say with real confidence, these are not the same family after all. These are two entirely separate mysteries that simply happen to share one dramatic misleading feature, absurdly oversized claws and nothing more. Two headline acts sharing a costume performing on completely different stages. So by the middle of the 1980s, one half of tonight's story had finally found solid ground beneath it. Therizinosaurus was no longer a turtle, no longer an unspecified predator, no longer even an open question. In any meaningful sense, it was a plant-eating theropod related to a small, oddly named demon lizard with a toothless beak, and to a handful of other strange wandering herbivores just beginning to turn up across Mongolia and China. But knowing what family this creature belonged to only answered one layer of the mystery. It still left the far stranger question sitting right there, waiting patiently, the same question that had haunted this story since the very first claws came out of the ground back in 1948. If this animal really was descended from fast, sharp-toothed hunters, if violence was quite literally written into its bloodline, how biologically, mechanically does an entire lineage manage to walk away from that inheritance so completely, and turn something built for killing into something built for nothing more threatening than pulling leaves off a branch? Let's try something a little different for a moment before we go any further into the desert together. Picture yourself as an engineer handed an absolutely absurd assignment. Take a machine built from the ground up, across millions of years of trial and error for exactly one purpose, running down prey, killing it efficiently, tearing it apart, and redesign that entire machine piece by piece to do something close to the opposite. feed it on leaves instead. Slow it down. Soften every part of it that used to be sharp. You cannot start from scratch the way a human engineer might scrap a bad design and begin again with a clean sheet of paper. You have to work with the parts you already have, repurposing a hunter's toolkit into a grazer's toolkit, one stubborn piece at a time. That essentially is the assignment evolution handed itself somewhere in the deep history of this strange family of dinosaurs, and what makes it worth pausing on tonight is just how strangely completely that assignment actually got carried out. We spent our last stretch of time together figuring out which family this creature actually belonged to. Tonight, or rather in the next few minutes, let's dig into something different, not who it was related to, but what its own body had to physically become in order to survive as something so far removed from its violent ancestry. Because almost nothing about this animal, once you actually look closely, stayed where evolution originally put it. Start with the hips, because honestly, this is where the whole story gets its strangest early. In a typical meat-eating theropod, the pubis, one of the main bones forming the pelvis, points forward and down, tucked in close to the body, a configuration built for speed and balance while chasing something down. In this creature, and in its close relatives, that same bone had rotated backward instead, swinging to point toward the tail rather than the head. Paleontologists call this an opisthepubic pelvis, and if that word means nothing to you, here is the plain version. The whole architecture of the hip had been rearranged to open up more internal space toward the back half of the body. Why would an animal need that extra room? Here is the answer, and it is honestly one of my favourite pieces of biology in this entire story. Digesting plants is hard work, genuinely difficult, slow, mechanically demanding work, requiring an enormous fermentation chamber low in the gut, where tough plant fibre can sit and break down over time, the same basic principle that gives a cow 4 stomachs and a horse an oversized cecum tucked behind its small intestine. A predator built for a quick, protein-rich meal simply does not need that kind of internal real estate. A piece of meat digests quickly and easily compared to a mouthful of fibrous leaves. A grazer absolutely does need it, and needs somewhere to put it. So the hip rotated, the body cavity widened, and this once streamlined hunting machine slowly grew the broad, rounded belly you would expect on something built to eat plants for a living rather than chase down a meal running full speed across open ground. Here is the detail that I think deserves a real pause though, because it connects to something much bigger than just one strange dinosaur family. That same backward rotated hip design shows up completely independently in 2 other major branches of the dinosaur family tree in birds, and in the entire other great division of dinosaurs, the Ornithischians, the group that eventually produced everything from Triceratops to duck-billed hadrosaurs. None of these 3 groups copied the idea from each other. They are not close relatives. This is convergent evolution in its purest form, 3 separate branches of the same broad family, arriving at nearly identical architecture, because they were all independently solving the exact same physical problem. How do you fit a much bigger digestive system into a body plan that was not originally built to hold one? Would you have guessed that a plant-eating theropod and a duck-billed dinosaur, separated by tens of millions of years of independent evolution, would land on almost the same hip design, purely because the math of digesting a salad only really works a couple of different ways? Now look upward toward the neck, because the same underlying logic shows up there too, just solving a different problem entirely. This family developed necks dramatically longer than almost any of their meat-eating relatives, and the reason has almost nothing to do with reaching prey and everything to do with efficiency. Think about the physical cost of feeding for a moment. If your food source is spread out across a wide area of foliage, and it usually is, you have 2 options: move your entire body constantly to reach each new mouthful, dragging that heavy new digestive system along with you every single time, or extend a long, flexible neck and let your head do the travelling instead while the rest of you stays comfortably still. The second option costs dramatically less energy, and in the natural world, energy saved is very often the difference between an animal that thrives and one that quietly struggles. It is the exact same logic that eventually produced sauropods with necks, stretching absurd distances across the Jurassic landscape, just applied here on a smaller theropod-shaped scale. Grow the neck, save the energy, spend less effort chasing your dinner around, because your dinner, being a tree, has the decency to stay in one place and wait for you. Then there is the head itself, and specifically the mouth, which might be the most complete transformation of all. We already talked about the moment scientists finally got a proper look at one of these skulls and what it revealed about diet. Tonight I want to go one layer deeper into the actual mechanics of that mouth, because the engineering involved is honestly beautiful once you slow down and look at it. The very front of the jaw lost its teeth entirely and grew a hardened beak, like covering instead, built from the same tough material as a bird's beak or a turtle's mouth today. That beak was not a decorative feature. It functioned as a precision cropping tool, snipping off individual leaves or shoots with far more control than a mouthful of blunt teeth could ever manage. Further back in the jaw, past where that beak ended, the remaining teeth had transformed to shrinking down into small, tightly packed leaf-shaped blades with fine serrations along the edge, essentially built for stripping and shredding plant material rather than puncturing flesh. It is a two-part feeding system, a beak up front for precision cropping a row of small serrated teeth, further back for processing what comes in, and neither part of that system has a single feature left over from the tearing, stabbing mouth its own ancestors would have carried. Even the feet change shape for the same underlying reason. Most theropods, your typical fast-hunting dinosaur, carry most of their weight on just 3 functional toes, with a smaller 4th toe held up off the ground, vestigial, barely touching down at all. This family, though, kept all 4 toes planted firmly on the ground, spreading the animal's considerable weight across a wider, more stable base. A predator built for speed does not need that kind of stability. Speed is the whole priority. A slow-moving, heavily built plant eater carrying that broad fermentation-ready belly we already talked about absolutely does need it. Every part of the body, it turns out, kept renegotiating with every other part weight. Here meant support there, which meant a change somewhere else entirely. An entire skeleton quietly reorganizing itself around one central shift in lifestyle. And now, finally, let's talk about the claws, because I think this is the moment this whole story has actually been building toward since the very first minute we spent together tonight. Remember how we started. 3 curved blades pulled out of the sand in 1948. So obviously, so unmistakably built for violence that nobody even considered another explanation for years. Here is what more recent biomechanical research has actually found, when scientists finally sat down and tested that assumption properly using models and stress analysis, rather than simply trusting how frightening the claws looked at first glance. The curve on these claws is too gentle, too shallow, to effectively pierce or hold on to anything that was actively struggling to get away. There is no sharpened cutting edge along the inner curve, either the kind you would expect on a tool actually built for slicing through flesh. Structurally, mechanically, tested against the same standards engineers use to evaluate any tool, these claws simply do not behave the way a hunting weapon needs to behave. They fail the test every single time. So what were they actually for? The leading explanation today treats them less like weapons and more like garden tools, hooks built for snagging a branch and drawing it down within reach of that beak we just talked about, or for stripping bark, or possibly even digging into insect nests for an occasional source of protein, the same rough category of behavior you would associate with a modern anteater rather than anything resembling a predator. Scientists studying this family have even reached for a very specific, very telling comparison point when naming some of these creatures the extinct giant ground sloths of a much more recent era. Enormous, gentle herbivores that also carried tremendous curved claws purely for hooking and pulling vegetation down to a comfortable eating height, animals so famously docile that their only real defense was sheer size rather than aggression. One relative of this very family carries the species name Megatheroids, which translates roughly to resembling Megatherium, the single most famous giant ground sloth of them all, a name assigned specifically because the two animals, separated by tens of millions of years and entirely unrelated to one another, ended up solving the exact same feeding problem with the exact same tool. Even the animal's own scientific name ended up quietly admitting what its claws were actually built for decades before most people were ready to believe it. Can you sit with that for a second, because I think it might be the whole emotional centre of tonight's story. The exact detail that's convinced an entire field of brilliant scientists this animal must have been a monster turned out once properly tested, rather than simply assumed to be nothing more threatening than an enormous pair of gardening hooks. How often do we do this ourselves with people, rather than dinosaurs decide someone is dangerous or cold or threatening, based on one striking, intimidating feature, a sharp tone of voice, an imposing size, a reputation that arrived second-hand long before we ever actually test whether that feature does what we assumed it did. We build entire personalities in our heads around a single data point, the same way an entire field of paleontology once built an entire monster around 3 curved bones. The claws never lied to anyone. Nobody ever actually asked them the right question, until decades had already passed. There is one more layer worth adding before we move on, because it softens this picture even further. Several close relatives of this family have been found, with clear evidence of feathers preserved directly on their bodies, simple downy coverings rather than anything built for flight. The kind of insulation you would expect on a warm-blooded animal that needed to regulate its own body temperature, rather than relying entirely on the sun the way a cold-blooded reptile would. No feathers have been directly preserved on the specific giant. We started this story with the fossil record simply has not been kind enough to offer that particular gift yet, but given how consistently its smaller relatives show this trait, most researchers today would be honestly surprised if this creature had not been covered in some kind of downy plumage as well. And in at least one location, fossilized footprints belonging to this same family, dozens of them discovered together in a single formation, suggest something even gentler still, that at least some of these animals move through their world in small groups alongside each other, rather than as solitary wanderers. Picture that image for a moment and let it replace whatever picture you were carrying around at the start of tonight's story. Not a lone monster stalking the Cretaceous floodplain with blades for hands. A soft-feathered, broad-bellied giant walking calmly alongside others of its own kind, occasionally reaching up with those famous curved claws to hook a branch down toward its beak, chewing quietly through an afternoon that had absolutely nothing violent about it at all. Every single piece of anatomy we just walked through, the hips, the neck, the mouth, the feet, and finally those claws was pointing toward that same gentle picture the entire time, each change reinforcing the others, an entire body slowly and completely rebuilding itself around one central shift in lifestyle. It simply took decades and a great deal of patient, careful science for anyone to actually believe what the bones were quietly trying to tell them all along, But anatomy on its own can only take a story so far because a body plan explains what an animal was capable of, not necessarily how it actually compares to the other giant mystery we have been circling all night. Because as it happens across an ocean of missing evidence and half a century of separate, unrelated confusion, something remarkably similar had been happening to that other creature too, the one still known for now mostly by its enormous arms, and the moment you finally set these two transformations side by side, the resemblance becomes almost impossible to ignore. Let's go back for a moment to that half-emptied quarry we left behind earlier tonight, because by 2009, once both seasons of digging were finally finished, scientists were no longer working with just two lonely arms anymore. They had ribs, they had a pelvis, they had long, sturdy legs, they had a tail carrying a row of unusually tall spines running along its length. Read that list back slowly and see if it does not sound just a little bit familiar after everything we just spent time exploring together. A wide pelvis, a heavier build than expected, a body clearly reorganizing itself around something other than speed and violence. It is almost impossible not to hear an echo of the very same transformation we just walked through piece by piece in an entirely different desert giant, the one whose claws started this whole story off well over an hour ago now. But echoes are not identical twins, and I think that distinction actually matters more than the similarity does. So let's slow down and look honestly at both sides of this comparison. Tonight, the parts that rhyme, and the parts that honestly do not, because I think the differences end up telling us just as much as the similarities do. Start with that tail, because it is one of the strangest details to come out of those 2006 and 2009 excavations, and it deserves more attention than it usually gets. The vertebrae running along this creature's back carried spines that grew progressively taller. The further back along the spine you travelled, some of them reportedly stretching to nearly the height of a grown adult standing beside them. Picture that shape for a second. A row of tall blade-like extensions rising up out of the spine, growing larger and larger toward the tail, like the teeth of some enormous half-buried comb. Scientists studying these bones notice something specific about their texture. Two rough ridged surfaces exactly like the kind you would expect where thick muscle or connective tissue had once attached the same pattern. You can still find today on the skeleton of a bison, right where its own famous shoulder hump sits, or on a camel for that matter, another animal whose entire silhouette is defined by a single dramatic feature. Most people assume they understand and mostly do not. That comparison matters because it tells us this was probably not a thin blood-filled sail built purely to catch sunlight or shed excess heat, the way certain other famous spine-backed dinosaurs are sometimes imagined and illustrated. It more likely supported something closer to a solid hump, fat storage, perhaps a reserve tank an enormous animal could draw on during lean seasons, or simply a dense mass of muscle and connective tissue running along the back. The kind of feature you see in large modern mammals for reasons ranging from energy reserves to visual display to plain structural support for an unusually heavy head and neck. Here is the honest scientific answer, and I promised you honesty over neat packaging earlier tonight. Nobody studying those 2006 and 2009 bones was entirely certain which of those explanations was correct just from the skeleton alone, and to some extent researchers are still debating the exact answer even now. What everyone could agree on was simpler and in its own way more interesting. This was an animal investing serious biological resources into carrying something large and heavy along its own spine for a purpose, worth that considerable cost, whatever that purpose specifically turned out to be. Now here is where the comparison to our other giant truly surprised people. Nothing remotely similar shows up on the back of Therizinosaurus or any of its close relatives. No hump, no blade-like spines climbing toward the tail, Two creatures both descended from the same broad ancestral stock of clawed meat-eating theropods, both eventually growing to enormous size, both developing those famously oversized hands, and yet one of them invested its evolutionary energy into an elaborate structure running the length of its spine, while the other simply never bothered with anything like it at all. If you have ever wondered whether shared ancestry guarantees a shared destiny, here is your answer. Sitting quietly in a fossilized vertebra, it does not. Not even close. The legs told an equally curious story, though a quieter one. When paleontologists finally had actual leg bones to study, rather than simply guessing from a family tree and a set of borrowed assumptions, what they found did not entirely match expectations. This creature's presumed relatives, the fast ostrich-like dinosaurs it was thought to be loosely connected to, were fast, lightly built runners, animals constructed almost entirely around speed and quick darting movement across open ground, with slender, hollow, almost delicate-looking limb bones built to minimize weight at every possible opportunity. These new leg bones were nothing like that. They were noticeably stockier, heavier, more robust through the shaft than a genuine sprinter's legs typically are thick, where a runner's legs would be thin, built for bearing weight rather than covering distance quickly. Something about this animal's lifestyle had apparently made raw speed far less important than it was for its slimmer, faster relatives, trading a runner's build for the kind of sturdy load-bearing limbs you would expect on something considerably heavier, considerably slower, and considerably less inclined to chase anything down at all. Can I ask you something here, because I think it connects to more than just leg bones? Have you ever known two people who came from almost identical circumstances, similar upbringing, similar early opportunities, similar starting points in life, who nonetheless grew into completely different versions of themselves? One moving quickly through the world, chasing every opportunity that presented itself. The other moving slowly and deliberately, weighing every step, each of them shaped by choices and pressures the other simply never faced. Siblings raised in the same house sometimes end up as close to opposites as two people can be. Shared origin never guarantees a shared outcome, not in families, and as it turns out, not in evolution either. The starting material can be nearly the same rough set of genetic tools, the same rough body plan inherited from a common ancestor. What gets built on top of that shared foundation depends entirely on the particular pressures each individual line happens to encounter along its own separate path, the particular landscape, the particular food available, the particular predators or dangers waiting nearby. Biology hands you a starting point. It rarely hands you a destination. The pelvis itself deserves its own moment too, because it's easy to lump it in with everything else and move on too quickly. This creature's hip bones came out of the ground noticeably expanded, wider and more robust than you would expect on a typical member of its presumed family, and the immediate temptation, especially right after everything we just learned about wide hips and fermentation chambers, is to assume the exact same explanation applies here as well. I want to resist that temptation on purpose, because good storytelling and good science share the same rule here. Do not force two different puzzles into the same shaped box just because they happen to rhyme. A wider pelvis can support a larger gut, certainly, but it can just as easily support a heavier overall body, extra reinforcement for an animal simply carrying more mass than its slender relatives, or additional muscle attachment for those unusually stocky legs we just talked about. The bone tells you something changed. It does not always tell you precisely why, and I think it is worth honestly sitting in that uncertainty for a moment rather than rushing past it toward a tidier conclusion. There is a broader pattern worth pulling back to see here, because what happened to these two creatures is really just one small example of something evolution does constantly all across the planet, in situations that have nothing to do with dinosaurs at all. Wings, for instance, evolved completely independently at least 4 separate times across the history of life on Earth. Once in insects, once in pterosaurs, once in birds, once in bats. Each lineage arriving at powered flight through entirely different anatomical routes, starting from entirely different limbs and entirely different ancestors, because flight happens to be an extraordinarily useful solution to certain problems, useful enough that evolution keeps rediscovering it from scratch whenever the opportunity presents itself. The camera-style eye-sharp lens-focused vision evolved independently in vertebrates and in octopuses, 2 lineages separated by such a vast evolutionary distance that their most recent common ancestor almost certainly could not see anything more sophisticated than the difference between light and dark. Even something as specific as a saber-shaped tooth shows up independently in several unrelated branches of the mammal family tree separated by tens of millions of years, because a long-curved killing tooth turns out to be an excellent solution, regardless of which particular skull happens to be growing it. Nature, it turns out, only has so many truly good solutions available to any given problem, and unrelated lineages keep bumping into the same excellent answers purely because those answers actually work over and over across wildly different starting points. Our 2 giants tonight belong to exactly that same pattern, just on a smaller, more personal scale. Wide hips for a heavier gut, 4-toed feet for extra support that shows up clearly in one, the very transformation we spent our last conversation walking through step by step. A dramatic dorsal hump, and unusually stocky legs that shows up distinctly in the other features its own claw-wielding relatives apparently never needed at all. Similar starting material, similar general size, similar oversized hands that first convinced 2 separate generations of scientists they were looking at monsters, and yet each lineage solved its own particular survival puzzle, with its own particular toolkit borrowing from a shared ancestral blueprint but editing it in completely different directions, the way 2 children raised on the same family recipe still somehow end up cooking completely different meals once they finally leave home and start improvising on their own. There was one more detail from those partial 2006 and 2009 specimens worth mentioning before we move on. A small one, easy to miss but oddly touching once you notice it. The very end of this creature's tail showed several vertebrae fused solidly together into a single compact structure, a configuration paleontologists sometimes compare to the fused tailbone found in modern birds. The same small bony knob at the base of a chicken or a pigeon that once anchored a full fan of tail feathers, and interestingly enough to a similar fused structure that shows up in some of those very same plant-eating relatives we introduced you to a little earlier tonight. 2 mysteries investigated decades apart by entirely different teams on entirely different continents worth of research funding, independently arriving at a similar structural solution at the very tip of the tail, even while everything else about their bodies diverged so sharply in almost every other direction. It is almost as if evolution occasionally leaves these small quiet signatures behind little reminders tucked into the least glamorous bones in the entire skeleton, that everything alive on this planet really is distantly, stubbornly related, no matter how differently the final products end up looking to the naked eye. I want to be careful here though, because I do not want to leave you with the impression that scientists, even by this point in the story, actually understood what this animal was, how it lived, or what it ate. They did not yet, not really. A pelvis and a set of legs can tell you an enormous amount about general body proportions, about weight, about probable speed, but they cannot tell you what filled that stomach, and they certainly cannot tell you what the face looked like, whether it carried teeth or a beak, whether it hunted or grazed, Or did something else entirely that nobody in that Mongolian laboratory had even considered yet? Every anatomical clue we have talked about tonight, the hump, the stocky legs, the fused tail, was a fragment of an answer. Not the answer itself, the kind of evidence that narrows the possibilities without ever quite closing the case. The single most important piece of evidence for answering any of those deeper questions, the skull, remained stubbornly, frustratingly absent from both of these two new specimens, exactly the way it had been absent from the very first arms pulled out of the ground back in 1965, more than 40 years earlier. And here is where this story takes one more sharp turn, because that missing skull, along with a set of equally missing feet, had not simply failed to fossilize the way missing pieces sometimes do after 70 million years underground. They had already been found. Years before either of these two careful, legitimate excavations ever began, someone else had already been digging in that exact same ground, working quickly, working in secret, working entirely outside the world of published papers and museum collections we've been following all night. What happened to those particular bones after they left the desert involves black markets, private collectors, and a chase spanning 3 separate continents. And honestly, it might be the strangest chapter in this entire story so far. Stranger even than a name meaning terrible hand, stranger than a claw once mistaken for a turtle's rib, stranger than any wrong guess or misplaced theory we've already spent tonight untangling together. Munich, Germany, 2011. Picture a cavernous convention hall filled with folding tables, each one covered in polished crystals, ancient shark teeth, chunks of amber, with insects trapped inside the general controlled chaos of a trade show, built entirely around selling pieces of the deep past to anyone willing to pay for them. This particular event happens every year, drawing collectors and dealers from across the globe, entire suitcases of fossils changing hands over the course of a single crowded weekend. And if you had wandered those aisles that particular year past the meteorites and the gemstones, past the polished ammonites, sold as paperweights, you might have walked directly past one of the most scientifically important dinosaur fossils on the entire planet without having the faintest idea what you were looking at. Let's rewind for a moment and trace exactly how a set of bones belonging to the very same skeleton we've been circling all night ended up sitting on a folding table in Germany instead of a laboratory in Mongolia where it actually belonged. Fossil poaching is not some rare exotic crime confined to adventure films. It is a real, ongoing, seriously damaging problem across large parts of the world, and Mongolia's Gobi Desert has suffered from it for decades. Here is the uncomfortable economic logic behind it, and I think it is worth understanding honestly, rather than judging from a comfortable distance. A dramatic, complete-looking dinosaur skeleton can sell to a private collector for truly staggering sums of money, sometimes more than a rural family in that part of the world might otherwise see across several lifetimes of ordinary work. For someone living close to that desert with truly limited economic options, and a set of unusual bones sitting right there in the ground beneath their feet, the calculation involved is not always the simple story of greed it gets reduced to in headlines. Mongolian law has protected these fossils as national property for decades, but law and enforcement are two very different things out in a desert roughly the size of several European countries, combined with only so many rangers and so many resources to patrol it. When the site that would eventually become known as one of this creature's 2009 excavation locations was first reached by legitimate, careful, government-sanctioned scientists, remember, they found broken blocks and scattered bones already waiting for them, evidence that someone else had gotten there first, working fast, working carelessly, taking exactly the parts most likely to fetch a serious price on the open market: a face, a set of hands, a set of feet, the parts a buyer could actually display on a shelf. Those particular bones then began a properly remarkable journey, one that reads less like paleontology and more like a smuggling case file, out of Mongolia first into the hands of a dealer somewhere along that chain, then apparently into Japan, then at some point into China, then France, eventually landing with a fossil dealer in Britain before finally surfacing publicly in Germany at that exact convention we just described sometime around 2010 and 2011. 4 or 5 separate countries, each one adding another layer of distance between these bones and the ground they had spent 70 million years resting in each transaction, chipping away a little more of the actual scientific story attached to them because the people buying and selling along that chain were not exactly filling out detailed provenance paperwork as they went. And here is a detail I still find almost impossible to say out loud without laughing a little, even though the situation itself is honestly serious. At one point during this journey, this exact fossil part of one of the most anticipated missing pieces in the entire history of dinosaur paleontology was photographed and briefly listed for sale on an online auction site. Let that sit with you for a second. One of the great unsolved mysteries of an entire scientific field, available at least for a little while to anyone with a shopping account and a large enough budget sandwiched somewhere between vintage electronics and second-hand furniture. If you ever needed proof that the line between the sacred and the absurd is thinner than we like to admit, I think the image does the job nicely. Word of an unusual, distinctly Mongolian-looking fossil began quietly circulating among the small, tightly connected community of serious fossil dealers, the kind of people who deal in strange bones for a living and develop a genuine eye for spotting something unusual amid the ordinary inventory. One of those people was a French dealer named François Esquillier, who ran a fossil business out of a small town called Ghana. Before we go any further, I want to actually paint an honest picture of this man, because the easy, lazy version of this story turns every fossil dealer into a villain, and that version happens to be wrong in his particular case. Esquillier had built something of a reputation over the years for a very specific, somewhat unusual habit. When he came across an important, scientifically valuable specimen that had clearly been taken illegally, rather than quietly selling it into another private collection for a healthy profit the way plenty of others in his position might, he had a track record of buying the piece himself and donating it directly to a museum instead, absorbing the financial risk personally so the science could actually happen. This was not a single act of unusual generosity either. In the years that followed this exact case, he would go on to spot at least one more significant specimen and report it the very same way a small, strange dinosaur eventually named partly in his own honour, a scientific nod to a reputation earned one honest choice at a time. It is a strange, morally complicated corner of the world to occupy someone operating inside a trade that causes real damage, while also functioning at key moments, as one of the only people capable of pulling important specimens back out of private hands and returning them to public science. When those particular bones crossed his path, he recognized something in them. The colour of the surrounding rock, reddish, dusty, unmistakably goby. The way the bone itself had preserved in 3 dimensions rather than flattened the exact quality scientists had already come to expect from Mongolia's Nemegt formation. He contacted a Belgian paleontologist named Pascal Godefroy at the Royal Belgian Institute of Natural Sciences in Brussels, an institution that happened to hold a truly unique legal status. It was, and still is, the only research institution in Europe formally authorized by the Mongolian government to help repatriate fossils that had been illegally removed from the country. If you were going to find the right person to call about a set of possibly stolen Mongolian bones, this was quite literally the one phone call in all of Europe that actually mattered. For a while afterward, and I think this detail deserves more attention than most retellings give it, Both men simply were not certain what to do next. They deliberated. They debated. Nobody rushed towards some dramatic cinematic decision the moment the bones appeared. Real ethical choices, even fairly clear ones in hindsight, rarely arrive with dramatic clarity attached in the moment. Sometimes they just sit there uncomfortable and unresolved, while two reasonable people quietly argue with themselves about the right next step. The decisive turn came in May of 2014, and here is where the story finally leaves the murky, uncertain middle and moves toward its resolution. Esquilier and Godefroy travelled together to Mongolia in person, carrying a skull that by that point they were confident belonged to the very creature. This entire story has been circling around all night. They sat down with Kishigjav Tsogtbata, director of Mongolia's own Institute of Paleontology and Geology, in Ulaanbaatar, a man both of them had worked with before and trusted. According to those present, Tsogtbata simply produced a photograph of the fossil as it had first appeared for sale in Germany, laid it on the table between them, and said quite plainly, "We need this specimen." 4 words. No negotiation theatre, no dramatic speech. Just an honest, direct statement of what was actually at stake. Esquilier, for his part, had already bought the fossil outright with his own money before that meeting ever happened, specifically so he would have the legal standing to hand it over cleanly, without complication, rather than leaving it tangled in someone else's private ownership claim. Think about that choice for a moment, because I think it is worth sitting with. A man who makes his living buying and selling ancient bones spent his own money not to keep something rare and valuable for himself, but specifically so he could give it away to a country that was not even his own. But recovering the bones themselves was only step 1, because a skull and a set of feet sitting on a table in Belgium do not automatically prove anything scientifically, not without a way to connect them beyond reasonable doubt to the specific animal already sitting headless in a Mongolian collection. This is where the story becomes something close to genuine forensic science, the kind of careful, patient detective work that rarely makes it into the more dramatic tellings of a discovery like this one. Remember that single leftover toe bone the excavation team had noticed back at the original quarry. Small, easy to overlook, the kind of detail that might have meant nothing at all, the sort of fragment a less careful team might have simply bagged and forgotten. When researchers finally compared it directly against the poached foot, Esquilier had recovered it fit. Not approximately, not roughly. The unprepared rock still clinging to the base of that lone toe bone matched, piece for piece, the empty gap left in the matrix surrounding the smuggled foot, like the last piece of a jigsaw puzzle somebody had accidentally dropped on the floor years earlier, only for someone else to find it again on the opposite side of the world. The colour of the surrounding stone matched too. The proportions matched. The size of the individual animal matched precisely. There was no overlap anywhere between the bones already in Mongolia's possession and the bones that had just come home, exactly what you would expect if every single piece truly belonged to one individual animal, and nothing you would expect if this were merely a convenient coincidence dressed up to look tidy. Can I ask you something here, because I think this whole chapter raises a truly uncomfortable question worth sitting with rather than rushing past. Who does the deep past actually belong to? A fossil that spent 70 million years in the ground, in a country most of the people bidding on it privately will never actually visit, formed by processes that had nothing to do with any nation, any border, any modern claim of ownership at all. Does it belong to whoever happens to be standing on that patch of ground the day it is uncovered? Does it belong to whoever can afford to pay the most for it once it surfaces? Or does it belong in some harder to define but more meaningful sense to everyone, to the shared human project of actually understanding where we all came from, a project that only works if the evidence stays available for study, rather than vanishing behind a private door. And yet the story we just walked through only ends well because people, institutions, and laws all agree that this particular skeleton belonged somewhere specific, belonged to a shared scientific record, rather than a private shelf belonged to the country, whose desert had protected it for so long in the first place. I do not think that question has one clean, universally satisfying answer, and I would be suspicious of anyone who claimed it did. But I do think the fact that this particular story ended with the bones going home, rather than disappearing permanently into someone's private collection, says something quietly hopeful about the people who happened to be standing in the right place when the choice actually mattered. On the 1st of May 2014, in a formal ceremony held at the Mongolian Academy of Sciences, that skull and those feet were officially handed back to the country they had been taken from. Think about everything that had to happen for that single quiet handshake in Ulaanbaatar to actually take place. A woman kneeling in the desert in 1965. 2 separate excavation teams returning to that same ground, decades later, a chance sighting at a trade fair on dealers' stubborn insistence on doing the harder, more expensive, more honest thing. After 49 years of missing arms after 2 partial skeletons excavated in the wrong order entirely after a criminal detour through at least 4 separate countries and 1 deeply unfortunate appearance on an online auction site, every major piece of this animal was finally physically sitting in the same building at the same time, for the very first time in its entire existence, alive or dead. And once that skull was finally cleaned, prepared and properly examined by the full research team, what it actually revealed turned out to be so strange, so far removed from every guess anyone had made across 50 years of speculation, that even scientists who had spent their entire careers studying dinosaurs found themselves honestly unprepared for what they were looking at. Let's actually rewind a few months before that ceremony. We just described back to November of 2013, to a conference room somewhere in the middle of a fairly ordinary annual gathering of paleontologists, the kind of professional meeting most people outside the field have never heard of, filled with researchers who spend their careers politely disagreeing with each other over minor details of ancient anatomy, presenting their findings to rows of colleagues who have quite honestly seen a great many new fossils in their time. Nobody walks into a room like that expecting fireworks. New fossils get presented constantly at these meetings, a slightly unusual tooth here, a rearranged joint there, the ordinary steady drip of scientific progress that rarely makes headlines outside the field itself. And then a paleontologist named Yongnam Lee stood up to present, and by the time he sat back down, several people in that audience were applauding a dinosaur the way you might applaud the end of a truly good film. Let's actually sit inside that room for a moment, because I think the reaction itself tells us almost as much as the discovery did. One researcher in attendance, a well-respected paleontologist from the University of Edinburgh, later admitted he walked in expecting a handful of minor additional bone fragments, the polite incremental kind of update this field usually produces on any given afternoon. Instead, he described himself as completely floored. Not disappointed by too little, the ordinary risk of any conference talk. Overwhelmed by too much, an entirely different and far rarer experience in a field built on patience and small hard-won increments of knowledge. After 48 years of nothing but 2 arms, the room was suddenly looking at something close to an entire animal projected onto a screen at the front of the hall, and by every account from people who were actually sitting in those chairs that day, the room did not quite know what to do with itself for a moment, caught somewhere between professional composure and outright astonishment. So let's look at what they were actually looking at, because after everything we have walked through together tonight, I think this animal has earned a proper unhurried introduction. Start with the numbers, because for nearly 50 years this was the one detail nobody could pin down with any real confidence. Remember all that shaky arithmetic back in 1965, scaling up from a Tyrannosaurus's tiny arms towards some impossible 100-foot monster that never actually existed anywhere outside a worried imagination. The real animal once fully measured from an actual complete skeleton, rather than a nervous guess stretched past 10 meters from beak to tail tip, and stood roughly 5 meters tall at its highest point, tall enough that it ranks among the very tallest theropod dinosaurs ever confirmed to have existed. Predator or otherwise taller than most of the fearsome hunters, this animal was once feared to be secretly related to. Big, undeniably. Not the impossible, cartoonish giant that early guesswork had once imagined circling somewhere out in the Cretaceous darkness, but honestly legitimately enormous all the same. Just enormous in a completely different shape than anyone had spent 50 years picturing. Now for the part that actually stopped that conference room cold the face, because for the very first time in this creature's entire recorded existence, spanning 1965, all the way through that morning in 2013, science finally had one to look at. The skull measured just over 1 meter in length, narrow, elongated, unusually tall, through the profile tapering down toward the front into something almost nobody in that room had predicted: a wide, flattened, entirely toothless bill spreading out to roughly the width of a dinner plate at its tip, deep and heavy, along the lower jaw in a way that suggested real functional strength rather than delicate decoration. Picture the general silhouette for a second. Something closer to a horse's long, gentle profile fused onto the front end of a duck. An image so strange that if you had sketched it purely from imagination, most people in your life would have quietly assumed you were joking, or possibly asked if you were feeling entirely well. There is a small, quiet detail buried in that skeleton that I think deserves its own moment, easy to miss entirely if you are only looking for the dramatic headline features like a duck-shaped bill or a camel-sized hump. Deep in the shoulder region, researchers identified a wishbone, the same U-shaped structure you would find today in essentially any bird you've ever eaten dinner from, holiday turkeys included, and this particular one turned out to be the very first confirmed example of that structure ever found anywhere in this creature's broader family of ostrich mimicking relatives. Nobody had ever seen one before in this group, not because it was not there, but because nobody had ever had a complete enough skeleton to go looking for it. A small bone easy to walk past in a museum display, quietly proving a bird-sized amount of the bird still lived inside this truly enormous animal, tucked away in a part of the skeleton nobody was even thinking to ask questions about. Here is the detail I actually want to sit with the longest tonight, though, because I think it might be the most human moment in this entire story, and it comes from an unexpected place. Back in 1970, when Halska Osmolska first formally described those original 2 arms, the ones a Polish expedition had carried out of the Gobi 5 years earlier, she offered her own best professional guess about what those enormous claws were actually built for. In her own published words at the time, she suggested they would have been useful in tearing dead or weakly agile prey asunder. Read that phrase again for a second and notice how careful, how measured, how entirely reasonable it sounds coming from a serious scientist working with the only 2 bones anyone had. The very scientist who gave this animal its name, working carefully, honestly with the best evidence available to her in 1970, assumed violence, the same instinctive leap nearly everyone in this story has made at some point all the way back to 3 curved claws pulled out of a different patch of desert in 1948. Can you sit with that for just a moment, because I think it closes a loop that has been quietly running underneath this entire story since the very beginning. It was never really about any one scientist being careless or wrong. It was about how consistently, how almost mathematically reliably the human mind reaches for danger first when handed an intimidating shape and nothing else to go on. Osmolska was not naive, and she was certainly not careless. She was one of the most respected paleontologists of her generation, someone whose other work still stands entirely unchallenged today. She was simply doing exactly what any of us would do, filling a gap in the evidence with the most immediately available explanation, and the most immediately available explanation for a claw that size will almost always be a weapon before it is ever considered a tool. It took this creature 44 more years, an entire additional skeleton, and a wildly improbable journey through 4 countries and 1 online marketplace just to correct a single sentence written in good faith back in 1970 by a scientist doing the very best she could with what the desert had chosen to give her. There is something almost tender about that if you let yourself sit with it, rather than rushing past. Science is often described as a slow argument with reality, one careful correction stacked on top of the last, and I think this is one of the clearest examples of that process you will ever find in one single animal. Nobody involved across this entire 50-year story was foolish. Everybody involved was working honestly with what they actually had in front of them. The mistake was never in the people. It was simply in how little any of them had to work with one skeleton at a time, one continent at a time, until finally enough pieces existed in the same room to tell the truth all at once. That November presentation, dramatic as it was still only a preview. The full formal scientific description followed several months later, published in 2014 in one of the most respected general science journals in the world, co-authored by a truly international team. Korean, Mongolian, Canadian, Japanese and Belgian researchers, all listed together on a single paper, an entire small united nations of paleontology, finally putting a name and a face to an animal that had outlasted every single guess made about it since 1965. It is worth noticing that detail too quietly before we move on. The mystery took a Cold War-era Polish expedition to begin, and it took researchers from 5 different countries cooperating across every political and institutional boundary you could imagine to finally finish. Let's put the rest of the animal together now, piece by piece, because after everything we've already spent time on tonight, most of these individual pieces should already feel familiar to you. Just finally reunited with a face at last. That long neck we mentioned earlier led up to a head considerably more substantial than anyone in the small-headed camp had guessed. Not the tiny, almost decorative skull some illustrators had once imagined perched delicately atop a therizinosaur-shaped body, but a proper functional head, deep-jawed and purposeful, built to do real work at the end of that bill. Below that neck, the hump we already spent real time exploring earlier tonight rose along the spine exactly where the vertebrae had promised it would be. Beneath that, a deep rounded torso, those famous arms attached exactly where they had always been attached, unchanged by any of this patiently correct about their own proportions the entire time, and beneath all of it, sturdy, broad, weight-bearing feet built as it turns out for something considerably softer underfoot than open, dry desert ground feet that made a great deal more sense once scientists finally understood where this animal had actually spent most of its life. Here is a question worth sitting with for a second before we go any further tonight. Have you ever finally met someone in person after knowing them only through reputation, through rumour, through the second-hand version of their story that circulates when the real person is not actually in the room to correct it themselves? Maybe someone from work whose reputation preceded them for months before you ever actually spoke, or a distant relative you'd only heard about through family stories told at holiday dinners. The gap between the rumour and the actual human being standing in front of you can be almost disorienting, cannot it not? because the rumour was necessarily malicious, but because absence always gets filled in with something, and what fills that gap rarely resembles the truth with any real precision. That conference room in November of 2013 was essentially watching that exact experience happen to an entire dinosaur at once. Decades of rumour, replaced in a single presentation by an actual physical face looking back at everyone in the audience. I want to be honest about one more thing before we move forward, because I do not want to leave you thinking. This presentation answered every remaining question about how this animal actually lived. It did not entirely, not yet. A skull tells you an enormous amount about general shape, about size, about the kind of feeding apparatus an animal was working with. A wide, toothless, duck-shaped bill clearly was not built for tearing flesh the way a predator's jaws would be. That conclusion was obvious almost immediately to everyone in that room. But a bill alone cannot tell you exactly what that animal actually chose to put inside it day after day, across an entire lifetime spent somewhere in that Cretaceous landscape. Shape tells you what was possible. It does not tell you what actually happened, what this particular animal actually reached for when it was hungry, on an ordinary afternoon 70 million years before anyone existed to ask it. For that particular answer, the truly satisfying specific answer scientists needed to look somewhere far less glamorous than a skull. They needed to look inside the animal's own stomach, and what they eventually found waiting there turned out to be stranger, and in its own quiet way, more moving than anything the skull alone had already told them. That part of the story, what was actually sitting inside this animal when it died 70 million years ago, in the exact spot where a Polish paleontologist would one day kneel in the sand and pull out its arms, deserves its own telling, because I think it might be the gentlest, most quietly devastating detail in this entire journey we have been on together tonight. It is one thing to look at a bill and reason your way toward a plausible diet. It is another thing entirely to open up a fossilized stomach and find the actual, literal, physical proof of an ordinary last meal preserved by pure geological accident for 70 million years, waiting patiently for someone to finally come looking. Somewhere inside the torso of that reassembled skeleton, tucked between the ribs and the belly, in a space that would once have held an actual working stomach, researchers began carefully sifting through the surrounding rock, the way you might sift through the ash of an old fireplace, looking for whatever the fire left behind, brushing away grain by grain, patient, in a way that ordinary life rarely rewards anymore. And what they found there was not one dramatic clue sitting neatly waiting to be photographed. It was more than 1,400 of them scattered across the exact space where digestion itself had once quietly taken place 70 million years earlier on some ordinary forgettable afternoon. 1,400 small, smoothed, rounded stones sitting exactly where a stomach would have been, each one small enough to fit in the palm of your hand, ranging from about the size of a grape up to something closer to a small egg. If you have ever watched a chicken peck absently at gravel in a backyard, you've already seen a miniature version of exactly what was going on here, just scaled up to match an animal the size of a school bus. Birds today, lacking teeth, often swallow small stones on purpose, letting a muscular pouch inside their own digestive system grind those stones against tough plant material the way a millstone grinds wheat between two turning surfaces. Scientists call these swallowed stones gastroliths, and finding 1,400 of them in a single animal was not a small detail buried in a dry academic footnote. It was one of the loudest, clearest signals paleontology can ever hope to receive about how an ancient animal actually chose to eat, a number too large and too deliberate to explain away as accidental. But here is where this particular discovery stopped being simply interesting and started being properly strange, because sitting among those 1,400 stones mixed directly into the same small patch of ancient stomach lining, researchers also found fish bones, vertebrae, scales, the unmistakable physical remains of actual fish swallowed, digested, and left behind in the exact same place as all those grinding stones. Sit with that combination for a second, because I think it is worth truly appreciating how strange it actually is. This is not the stomach of a plant eater who occasionally accidentally swallowed something unfortunate, and it is certainly not the stomach of the terrifying predator this animal was once assumed to be, back when nothing but 2 arms sat in a drawer somewhere and an entire field filled in the rest with its own worst imagination. This is the stomach of something else entirely, something science did not really have a tidy pre-existing box ready and waiting for. An enormous, gentle omnivore grinding down plant matter with swallowed stones, while also apparently without any hesitation whatsoever, hoovering up the occasional fish along the way. Let's talk about how that actually would have worked, because the mechanics involved are almost more entertaining than the discovery itself. Researchers examining the jaw noticed something telling the muscle attachment points, where a proper bite would need real anchoring, were surprisingly small. Weak, poorly developed for an animal of this size, nothing like the reinforced, heavily muscled jaw joints you would find on an actual hunter, built to clamp down and hold on. This was not an animal built to clamp down hard on anything, ever, no matter how badly 50 years of imagination wanted it to be. What its deep, elongated lower jaw did suggest instead was room for a truly enormous tongue, the kind of tongue that could work almost like a pump drawing soft material up into that broad, flattened bill through suction, rather than force the same basic principle a straw uses, just built out of muscle and cartilage instead of plastic. Picture it moving slowly through shallow water at the edge of some ancient river, dipping that bill down into soft mud and essentially vacuuming up whatever happened to be sitting there. Tender water plants, algae, small fish that had not moved out of the way quickly enough, all of it disappearing into a mouth that never once needed to bite down on anything in its entire life. Can I be honest with you for a second? Because I think this deserves an honest laugh rather than pure reverence. For nearly 50 years, this animal held a reputation as one of the single most frightening theoretical predators paleontology had ever produced, whispered about in encyclopedias sketched with bared teeth and outstretched claws, a monster built specifically to terrify anyone who so much as glanced at those 2 arms in a museum case. And the actual truth, once fully assembled, turned out to be an enormous, softly built creature, standing knee-deep in a swamp, sucking up mud and the occasional unlucky minnow, like the world's largest, strangest vacuum cleaner, more interested in soft plants and slow-moving fish than in anything resembling a fight. Somewhere out there, every single artist who ever drew this animal baring its teeth owes it a small, quiet apology. If that is not one of the great punchlines in the entire history of paleontology, I honestly do not know what would qualify. There is one more piece of evidence worth sharing here, and I think it might be the single most quietly ironic detail in this entire story. Remember, this whole 50-year saga began with the assumption that these enormous arms must have belonged to a devastating predator, something capable of standing toe-to-toe with the largest hunters the Cretaceous world ever produced. Something people seriously worried might have outmatched Tyrannosaurus itself in a straight fight. Here is what the actual bones eventually revealed instead. Marks on this creature's own skeleton bite, marks deep, unmistakable, the kind that only come from teeth pressing hard into living or recently living bone match, almost exactly what you would expect from the teeth of Tarbosaurus, the very same tyrannosaur relative that ruled that particular corner of the Cretaceous world with genuine, well-documented ferocity. The animal once feared as a possible rival to the greatest predators alive was not a rival to them at all. It was at least on this occasion a meal chewed on by exactly the kind of creature it had once been mistaken for. Think about the sheer distance this story has travelled from 1965 all the way to this single detail. An animal discovered by its arms alone immediately assumed to be a monster, capable of matching Tyrannosaurus. Itself spends nearly 50 years wearing that reputation like a borrowed coat that never actually fit, only to be revealed in the end not as anyone's rival, but as prey, a slow, gentle, mud-sucking giant that ended up on the losing side of an encounter with something smaller and considerably more dangerous than itself. Here is a question worth sitting with tonight, because I think it reaches well beyond dinosaurs. How often do we assume the most intimidating-looking thing in the room must also be the most dangerous one, when in reality size and menace do not always travel together the way our instincts insist they should? The largest, most physically imposing person in a conversation is not always the one actually capable of hurting you. The loudest voice is not always the one worth fearing. Sometimes the quietest, softest-looking presence in the room turns out to be the one with actual teeth. And sometimes the enormous clawed, wide-armed figure everyone instinctively steps back from is simply standing in shallow water, minding its own business, hoping nobody bothers it while it hunts for the next mouthful of algae. This animal spent its entire scientific reputation trading on raw, unearned intimidation, purely because two enormous arms are truly difficult to look at without flinching a little, and the actual truth turned out to be gentler, stranger, and considerably more vulnerable than anyone ever gave it credit for. Even the dramatic hump running along its spine, the one we already spent real time exploring earlier tonight, picked up a slightly clearer explanation once the full skeleton was finally available for study. Lee and his colleagues, after examining everything together, leaned away from picturing it as a thin, blood-filled sail, and away from a simple fatty hump too, both perfectly reasonable earlier guesses that the fuller picture ultimately complicated. What they proposed instead was something closer to an internal support structure, ligaments and connective tissue running down from those tall spines, like the guy wires holding up a radio tower, helping brace an unusually heavy belly, and a set of stocky hind legs against the ordinary constant pull of gravity on an animal this size. An anatomical answer with considerably less drama attached to it than either of the earlier guesses admittedly, but a more honest one. And honestly, I think there is something almost sweet about that. Even this creature's strangest, most dramatic-looking feature turned out to serve a purpose about as unglamorous and practical as a good sturdy piece of scaffolding. I think it is worth pausing here to truly appreciate just how thoroughly every single guess made across those 5 decades turned out to be incomplete. The carnivore theory was wrong. The therizinosaur relative theory was wrong. Even the oversized ostrich theory, the one that eventually turned out closest to correct on classification alone, completely failed to anticipate a hump, a sail, a bill built like a vacuum, or a stomach full of fish. Every single illustrator, every toy company, every encyclopedia editor across 5 decades was working in good faith with the best available evidence of their particular moment, and every single one of them still ended up somewhere far from the truth. Nobody's imagination across an entire scientific field, across 50 years of properly excellent guesswork from properly excellent scientists, landed anywhere close to what evolution had actually produced. I find something quietly comforting in that, honestly. Reality did not just correct our fear, it simply outran our imagination entirely in a direction absolutely nobody thought to look, which might be the single most humbling lesson paleoart has ever handed this particular field. The scientists themselves settled on a term for what they had found, one that shows up directly in their own published research: a mega omnivore living in what researchers describe as a mesic environment, a fancy precise way of saying comfortably damp, riverside wetland adjacent terrain, the kind of soft green waterlogged landscape that could support exactly this sort of gentle, mud-loving giant, quite unlike the parched, cracked basin we described at the very start of tonight's story, even though both landscapes belong to that same broad stretch of Cretaceous Mongolia at different points in its long history. 3 separate specimens of this animal found scattered across roughly 50 kilometers of that same ancient formation suggest this was not some rare, isolated oddity. Either a single, strange individual that wandered too far from home, but a genuine established resident of that particular corner of the Cretaceous world, quietly wading through shallow water for who knows how many generations before any of this became a 50-year mystery for anyone at all. One specimen even carried a healed fracture along a rib, evidence of some injury survived, and recovered from a small quiet reminder that every single one of these bones once belonged to an individual animal that lived an actual life with its own particular close calls long before it ever became a chapter in someone else's story. So here finally is the complete picture, the one that took very nearly half a century, 2 accidental amateur poachers, 3 separate legitimate excavation teams, 1 honest fossil dealer and researchers from 5 different countries, to fully assemble piece by scattered piece, continent by continent, not a monster. Not even in the end a particularly close cousin to the gentle giant whose claws open this whole story for us tonight, despite everyone's early suspicions that the two might be related. Something entirely its own, an enormous soft-bellied fish, eating mud-sucking wanderer, carrying the most intimidating-looking arms in the entire fossil record, purely by evolutionary accident arms that turned out to have almost nothing to do with the animal's actual remarkably unthreatening way of life. 50 years of fear resolved by a swallowed rock and a handful of fish bones. And that irony leads us somewhere unexpected before we close out this half of the story, because if a predator as capable as Tarbosaurus could bring down something this size, this heavily built, this properly enormous, then it raises an honest question worth carrying into whatever comes next. How did this creature's own distant cousin, the clawed, equally enormous giant whose mistaken identity started this entire journey well over 2 hours ago, now manage to walk through that exact same predator-infested landscape, and as far as the fossil record can tell us, come out the other side essentially untouched? Here is something worth correcting before we go any further tonight. A small mental image most of us are probably still carrying around without realizing it. When you picture the Gobi Desert 70 million years ago, home to every creature we have spent tonight getting to know, you are almost certainly still picturing sand heat and not much else, because that is simply what the word desert does to our imagination, conjuring up dunes and shimmering heat rather than anything green or alive. Let go of that picture completely, because the actual Nemegt formation, during the exact window of time these animals were alive, carried an average yearly temperature somewhere around only 7 or 8 degrees, cool damp threaded through with rivers and seasonal flooding closer in feeling to a temperate river delta in early spring than anything resembling the scorching landscape that eventually buried these bones millions of years later. The desert came afterward, long afterward. The life came first in a world considerably gentler, greener and quieter than the one that would eventually preserve it in stone, and that world was crowded properly, crowded in a way I do not think we have painted for you yet tonight. Picture herds of duck-billed hadrosaurs grazing low vegetation in noisy honking groups. Picture armoured ankylosaurs built like walking tanks moving slowly through the undergrowth entirely unbothered by anything smaller than themselves. Picture titanosaurs, enormous long-necked plant eaters, distantly related to the largest animals ever to walk the earth, reaching up into the same high branches. Our own clawed giant was reaching toward two unrelated giants, quietly sharing the same treetop buffet. Picture small, sharp-eyed troodontids darting through the undergrowth, hunting anything smaller than themselves, oviraptorosaurs tending nests full of eggs, and strangest of all, a creature called Mononychus, barely the size of a chicken with a single stubby claw on each stunted arm going about its own tiny, mysterious business entirely unbothered by the giant stepping carefully around it. This was not an empty stage with one or two main characters standing quietly under a spotlight. It was a full, noisy, competitive ecosystem, dozens of species negotiating the same limited resources at once, and somewhere in the middle of all of it walked our clawed giant quietly minding an entirely different kind of business than nearly everyone else around it. So let's finally answer the question we ended on a moment ago. If a capable predator like Tarbosaurus could bring down an animal the size of our other giant tonight, how did this particular creature manage to spend its entire existence, as far as the fossil record can currently tell us, without a single confirmed predation event against an adult of its kind? The answer starts with simple geometry, and honestly I find something almost comical about how straightforward it actually is. A team of researchers named Center and James sat down in 2010 and did the actual math on this exact question, comparing the height of a standing adult against the reach of Tarbosaurus's own jaws, treating it less like paleontology and more like a geometry problem worked out on graph paper. Their conclusion, worked out through careful measurement rather than guesswork, was that a full-grown Tarbosaurus, for all its genuine ferocity, simply could not physically reach any higher than the thigh or the belly of an adult standing upright. Not the throat, not the neck, not anywhere close to a vital killing target. Just the lower legs and belly, the least useful place in the world to land a killing bite on an animal several tons in weight, easily capable of shifting its full body mass directly on top of you the moment you make the attempt, crushing far more than it could ever hope to bite through. Take a second and actually picture that scene playing out in real life, because I think it is a truly striking one. An adult Tarbosaurus, 40 feet of muscle and teeth, one of the most capable hunters ever produced on this planet, standing at the base of something considerably taller than itself, looking directly up rather than down, the way you might look up at someone standing on the second floor of a building while you remain on the ground. Every single advantage a predator normally relies on reach leverage. The ability to strike a vital point quickly and decisively simply evaporates the moment your intended meal happens to be taller than you are. Height in this particular case was not just an impressive statistic to put in an encyclopedia. It was quite literally a functioning defense system built entirely out of basic physical reach. Height solved more than just the predator problem too, and this is worth pausing on because survival in a crowded ecosystem is never only about staying alive. It is also about finding enough to eat without constantly fighting your neighbours over the same patch of leaves. Most of the herbivores sharing that landscape, the hadrosaurs in particular, fed low-cropping vegetation close to the ground, the way modern deer or cattle graze a field. Our clawed giant, standing tall enough to reach branches well above that crowded lower layer, effectively opened up an entire private dining room several feet above everyone else's head, a resource nobody down at ground level could easily compete for. It likely still had to share that higher tier with the titanosaurs, those enormous long-necked plant eaters capable of reaching just as high or higher But even that competition would have been far gentler than fighting an entire ecosystem of ground-level grazers for the exact same scarce mouthfuls day after day. Being tall, in other words, was not just a defense against being eaten. It was also quietly a strategy for making sure there was always something left to eat. Can I ask you something here, because I think it applies well beyond dinosaurs? Have you ever noticed how often real safety comes less from being aggressive and more from simply being difficult to profitably attack in the first place? A predator. Any predator is running a constant quiet cost-benefit calculation every single time it considers a meal. How much energy will this cost me? How much risk am I taking on? Is there an easier option somewhere nearby that will not require me to reach dangerously far above my own head for an uncertain result? Sometimes the safest position available to any creature, dinosaur or otherwise, is simply making yourself expensive enough, awkward enough, costly enough to bother with that anyone considering the attempt quietly decides to look elsewhere instead. Height alone, though, was not the entire strategy, and I want to be fair to the full picture here rather than oversimplifying it into one clean, tidy explanation. Those enormous claws we already spent real time exploring earlier tonight likely played a secondary role in all of this too, though the exact nature of that role remains even now a truly open scientific question, and I think that honesty matters more than a confident, tidy answer would. Several researchers have pointed out that despite their intimidating size, these particular claws were probably too thin, too gently curved, structurally too fragile to actually win a direct physical confrontation against something the size and strength of an adult Tarbosaurus. A single solid bite from a predator built like that would likely have snapped one of those claws rather than the other way around. So if they were not built to win a fight outright, what exactly were they doing hanging off the end of both arms? The leading answer, and honestly one of my favourite ideas in this entire story, is intimidation rather than combat. A full-grown adult rearing up onto its hind legs, spreading a pair of metre-long claws wide in clear view, would have presented an image any reasonably intelligent predator might choose to simply walk away from, not because those claws were guaranteed to actually connect or actually do serious damage, but because the visible risk alone was not worth testing against an easier, less dramatically equipped meal, standing somewhere nearby in that same crowded ecosystem. There is actually a fascinating, quite recent piece of research worth mentioning here too, a 2023 study that went so far as to suggest these claws may have carried no meaningful mechanical function at all by that point in the animal's evolution, having simply grown progressively larger and larger over generations purely as a visual signal, a phenomenon researchers sometimes call evolutionary overgrowth. Roughly the same underlying principle behind a peacock's tail or a stag's antlers features that exist less because they are useful tools, and more because they successfully communicate something to anyone looking at them. Nature, it turns out, is perfectly willing to grow something purely for the message it sends, with no practical function attached at all, provided the message itself does enough work to justify the cost. I have heard more than one paleontologist compare the overall picture to something surprisingly familiar and considerably less frightening than any of this might sound so far: a giant panda. Think about that comparison for a moment, because I think it is oddly perfect. A panda is enormous, physically powerful, entirely capable of causing real damage if it actually chose to, armed with claws and jaws considerably more functional than most people give it credit for, and yet spends the overwhelming majority of its life doing nothing more dramatic than sitting quietly and eating vegetation its size and strength functioning as a kind of background insurance policy. It rarely, if ever, needs to actually cash in. Nobody watching a panda calmly chew bamboo assumes they are looking at something harmless, purely because it looks gentle. They assume it correctly because the panda itself has almost never given anyone a reason to think otherwise. Our own giant may well have lived a remarkably similar existence, an animal that could have been dangerous in theory if seriously pressed, but mostly just needed to look sufficiently dangerous to be left alone entirely, day after day for its entire life. I do want to add one honest complication before we move forward, because a clean, universally happy ending would not be entirely accurate here either. All of this protection almost certainly applied most reliably to a full-grown adult, a smaller, younger individual not yet at full height, not yet carrying claws anywhere near their eventual adult size, would have presented a considerably less intimidating target, and there is no strong reason to assume juveniles enjoyed anything like the same level of safety their parents did. Growing up in that particular ecosystem likely meant surviving a properly dangerous adolescence first, before eventually earning the kind of size that made the adult version of this animal something predators simply preferred to leave alone. There is something worth sitting with in that detail too, something that reaches beyond dinosaurs entirely. Safety for this animal was never something it was simply born with. It was something it had to grow into patiently over years, surviving the exact vulnerable window when none of its eventual advantages, the height, the claws, the sheer physical mass had fully arrived yet. I think there is a quiet, honest kind of comfort in that idea if you let yourself sit with it for a moment. Whatever eventually makes you difficult to threaten, whether that is size or reputation, or simple, hard-won experience, it rarely arrives all at once. Mostly it is something built slowly, one uncertain season at a time, long before it ever starts to feel like protection. So here is where our clawed giant finally landed after everything this story has walked through together tonight. A mistaken turtle, a mistaken predator, a family finally identified through smaller, humbler relatives, and now finally an adult life spent standing safely above almost everything else in its own crowded, competitive corner of the Cretaceous world, tall enough to browse in relative peace, imposing enough to be left alone and only ever truly vulnerable during the years before it had fully grown into the very body that would eventually keep it safe. Two giants born from the same broad, ancient stock of clawed meat, eating theropods walk through that exact same dangerous, crowded landscape, and found two completely different paths toward the same basic goal, staying alive long enough to matter, long enough to grow old, long enough to pass something forward. One did it by wading quietly through the shallows, gentle and mostly unnoticed, trading size for camouflage in plain sight. The other did it by growing so tall that danger simply had to look elsewhere, trading speed and stealth for sheer undeniable presence. And after spending this much time with both of them tonight, claws and arms turtles, and terrible hands poachers and paleontologists, patient scientists and honest fossil dealers scattered across half a dozen countries, I think it is finally time to step back from the individual details and ask what this whole sprawling, decade-spanning story actually adds up to once you look at the full shape of it, laid out together in one place from that very first afternoon in 1948, all the way to tonight. Let's slow down together for these last few minutes, because I think this particular story has earned a gentle landing rather than a hurried one. We have covered a great deal of ground tonight: deserts and draws, claws and arms, honest mistakes made by careful people, and I think the fairest thing I can do now is simply slow my own voice down and let all of it settle somewhere comfortable before we close our eyes. Somewhere in the middle of everything we have walked through tonight, 70 million years came and went for these two animals, in what felt from where we are sitting like the span of a single evening. 3 curved claws pulled from the sand in 1948. A pair of impossible arms lifted out of a different patch of that same desert 17 years later. Wrong guesses corrected slowly, sometimes painfully, by honest people working with almost nothing to go on one careful excavation at a time, one honest correction at a time. And at the very end of all of it, two enormous gentle animals finally allowed to simply be what they always were, without the borrowed fear that clung to them for most of their scientific lives, a fear that never actually belonged to them in the first place. Here is a detail I've been holding on to until now, because I think it belongs at the very end rather than anywhere earlier. 66 million years ago, an object from space roughly the size of a small mountain struck the Earth in what is now the Gulf of Mexico, and within a geological instant the world these two animals had spent their entire lives quietly wandering through simply ended. Not just for them. For roughly 3 out of every 4 species alive on the planet at that moment, an extinction so total and so sudden that almost nothing large enough to be called a dinosaur survived it anywhere on Earth. Our clawed giant wading through wetlands and reaching into high branches, our other giant sucking mud, and the occasional fish out of some quiet river shallow. Both of them, along with nearly everything else we have mentioned tonight, the hadrosaurs, the titanosaurs, the tiny chicken-sized oddities darting through the undergrowth, gone within what geologists now describe almost gently as no time at all, a single terrible afternoon written across millions of years of rock. I do not say that to end this story on a sad note, though I understand if it lands that way for a moment sitting there in the dark. I say it because I think it adds something important to everything we've already talked about. These were not indestructible creatures. They were not the invincible monsters early guesswork once imagined, either immune to danger simply by virtue of being enormous. They were simply animals living out fairly ordinary lives in a properly dangerous world, doing the quiet work of surviving one season at a time, the exact same project every living thing before or since has ever actually been engaged in, including in its own much shorter way every single one of us listening tonight. Their story does not end triumphantly with the monster defeated, or the mystery neatly closed with a bow on top. It ends the way most true stories eventually do, with time simply continuing on, indifferent to how gentle or how misunderstood you happen to be while you are here, indifferent honestly to almost everything except its own steady patient passing. Here's something worth sitting with for a moment, and I promise this is the last question I will ask you tonight. These two animals shared the exact same formation, the exact same rough stretch of ancient river delta, quite possibly the exact same handful of decades within that formation's long history. Is it possible they actually crossed paths at some point too, enormous misunderstood giants, passing within sight of each other across some ordinary Cretaceous afternoon, neither one paying the other much attention, each one utterly unaware that they would eventually become tangled together in the very same human mystery, 66 million years later, studied by people from opposite ends of an entirely different planet's history, in languages that did not yet exist in countries whose borders had not yet been imagined. I like to imagine they did honestly, even though no fossil will ever confirm it for us one way or another, and I do not think there is anything wrong with allowing ourselves that particular piece of imagination provided we are honest about calling it exactly that. Two gentle giants born from the same violent ancestry, quietly grazing within sight of each other, both of them completely unaware of just how frightening the rest of the world would eventually decide they must have been, and both of them, as it happens, equally wrong about the other. Let's actually count for a moment everyone this story required to finally arrive at the truth, because I do not think we have properly honoured that list yet tonight, and I think a story like this one deserves a proper closing credit sequence, even if nobody usually thinks to give it one. A Soviet scientist who spent his evenings writing science fiction kneeling in the sand in 1948, carrying claws he could not begin to explain back across thousands of miles of desert. a researcher trained to study mammal skulls, reaching instead for the closest thing science had on record, a giant sea turtle, and getting it beautifully understandably wrong. A Polish woman who first dreamed of that desert while attending secret university lectures during a war defying an occupying army, simply by choosing to keep learning in a borrowed apartment, and who went on to lead expeditions no woman had ever led into that same desert before her. Two Mongolian scientists decades later, finally solving a piece of their own country's deepest mystery using bones from a small, strangely named demon lizard nobody outside the field had ever heard of, a fossil dealer who could have quietly profited from a stolen skull and chose honesty, instead spending his own money to make sure the right thing happened. Researchers from Korea, from Canada, from Belgium, from Japan, all eventually gathering around the very same reassembled skeleton in a Mongolian laboratory, each one contributing some small necessary piece nobody else could have supplied alone. Not one single genius solved either of these mysteries by themselves. Not one dramatic breakthrough moment carried the whole weight of it. It took an entire, slow, occasionally clumsy relay race across 3/4 of a century and a half, the countries on this planet, each person simply carrying the truth a little further than the person before them, had managed to then quietly handing it forward to whoever came next. I think that might be the actual lesson worth carrying to bed with you tonight, more than any single fact about claws or arms or fish bones we've spent the last few hours on. We tend to imagine scientific breakthroughs as sudden, dramatic, alone, brilliant mind connecting dots nobody else could see. In some flash of solitary genius, the kind of moment a film would compress into 30 triumphant seconds, with music swelling underneath it. The real story almost always looks much more like what we just spent the last few hours walking through together. Patient, unglamorous, frequently wrong before it was finally right, carried forward by ordinary people, simply doing their honest best with whatever small piece of evidence happened to land in their own two hands that particular decade. Nobody in this story got to see the whole shape of it, while they were living through their own small part of it. Maleev never lived to see his turtle theory gently corrected. Osmolska never saw the actual face behind the arm she once quite reasonably assumed belonged to a killer. Each of them simply did their honest, careful work, handed it forward, and trusted, whether they ever said so out loud or not, that someone eventually would finish what they had started. If that describes anything about your own week, your own slow progress on something that matters to you, some project you cannot yet see the ending of, some question about yourself, or someone you love that still refuses to fully resolve, I think that is worth feeling good about rather than discouraged by. Slow, honest, occasionally wrong work is still exactly how the truth usually gets found in laboratories and deserts, and just as often quietly in ordinary lives that will never make it into any documentary at all. Picture that desert one more time before we close our eyes tonight the way we pictured it hours ago at the very beginning of this story, back before you knew any of the names or any of the mistakes or any of the quiet corrections that eventually followed them. The same wind moving across the same red cliffs at sunset, the same vast quiet stretch of Mongolia that once held rivers and forests and two enormous misunderstood giants wading through shallow water without a single worry about how strange their reputation would eventually become long after they themselves were gone. All of that is sand now, and silence, and the occasional careful footstep of someone still out there looking for whatever the ground has not yet decided to give up, someone kneeling exactly the way Ivan Yefremov once knelt, exactly the way Zofia Kielan-Jaworowska once knelt, patient in that same particular way the desert seems to demand of anyone who wants anything from it. But for a little while tonight, for the length of one long story told just before sleep, That quiet desert got to be loud again, full of claws and arms and gentle misunderstood giants, moving peacefully through a world that never actually needed anyone to be afraid of them at all. Maybe that is worth carrying with you into your own sleep tonight, whatever version of it applies to your own life. Whatever looks the most intimidating about you, or about someone you have quietly misjudged without ever quite meaning to, might simply be misunderstood, rather than dangerous a pair of gardening hooks mistaken for something built to hurt, a soft, patient creature wearing a reputation it never actually earned and never actually asked for. Maybe it is a sharp edge you show the world purely because showing anything softer once felt too risky. Maybe it is a silence people have learned to read as coldness, when really it was never anything more than caution, or tiredness, or simply not yet having the right words ready in the moment they were needed. It took the desert 70 million years and an entire relay of patient, honest strangers just to tell the truth about two dinosaurs. Some truths simply take time, and there is nothing wrong with letting them in the ground, in a laboratory or in your own life at whatever pace they happen to need. I think, too, there is something worth holding on to in how this particular story chose to end, not with triumph, not with a villain finally defeated, but with simple patient correction, offered gently accepted honestly by people who are never trying to be right, so much as trying to be accurate. That is a rarer, quieter kind of ending than most stories bother giving us, and I happen to think it is a better one. No monster needed slaying tonight, just two misunderstood giants, and enough patient people willing to look a little closer, a little longer before finally deciding what they were actually looking at. And thank you honestly for staying with both of these giants the whole way through tonight, from the very first claw to this very last quiet minute. Stories like this one only work because someone is willing to sit with the slow, uncertain middle of them, the decades of not knowing the wrong guesses, the long silences between one discovery and the next, rather than skipping straight to whatever tidy ending comes at the very end. You did that tonight patiently, the same way every scientist in this story eventually had to. That is not nothing, and I do not take it for granted. Rest well tonight. Let the wind in that old red desert be the last thing you picture as your own eyes close, moving slowly over cliffs that have not changed shape in longer than any of us can properly imagine, carrying nothing now but dust and quiet, and the occasional sound of something small settling deeper into the sand. Picture two gentle giants finally at peace, with who they turned out to be no longer wearing borrowed reputations, no longer misunderstood, simply resting exactly where they have rested for 70 million years, patient the whole time the way the truth so often is, and you, wherever you are listening from whatever city, whatever quiet room, whatever hour it happens to be, where you're allowed to close this particular story exactly the same way, slowly, gently, with nothing left to fear from either giant, and nothing left to do now but let your own eyes finally close too.